Hello. Um, Welcome to another exciting edition of Victory Never Sleeps. As you guys may have noticed on the intro, going through a lot at my house right now. My mother passed away yesterday, so she'd been battling dementia for a long time. So it's not startling, but it is sad. And I've got family coming into town this weekend, and just to let you all know, and yeah, so anyways, if I'm a little bit spaced out, that might be why. Apologize in advance. Um, Today we have Witan Svan on once again, and tonight we talk about the first of our goddesses we're going to discuss. We're going to talk tonight about Frigg. Um, Svan, and I think that she is well known as far as our deities go, but for anybody who doesn't know, could you give people kind of a rundown on Frigg and who she is?
Yeah. First and foremost, I wanted to express my condolences. And I know that Frigg she's the one in situations like this where I would say definitely seeking spiritual resolve and healing in times of great, loss and sadness, is I think one of the things that our folk really should take resolve in is that the Frigga or Frigg is the goddess of motherhood. She is the mother goddess. She is the Ausenya of wisdom, resolve, peace, frith, bounty. So much of I think that any man and woman in the folk knows the power of Frigg from the moment they enter into this world. She is the threshold. She is the first door, if you will, and she sets the great process of our folk forward in building the foundations of what would be the nation from the tribe and starting with the family. She is the pinnacle mother goddess. So I feel that for anybody that is new to Asatru, that finding this moment, if you are in need of guidance, wisdom, temperance, it is most sought after through Frigg. She is often associated with birth, but motherhood in general, femininity, especially a type of femininity that is very important to the folk. I would say that's the dutiful femininity, whereas perhaps other Ausenir, they may represent different types of femininity or chthonic forces of the earth. Frigga represents the that which all things are grown from. She's the source of the bounty and the fruitfulness of the gods. She is the mother of Balder, and so she oftentimes, I think, in our society and in our culture, she is the paragon of wisdom and all the duties of a woman that's bound in our society as a mother. And that has a lot of implications, and a lot of people might not understand that. For us, there are no crones per se, as there are the levels. I think that most people don't realize is in Teutonic cultures that there is the maiden or the young girl, there is the woman, and then there is the mother, and the mother never ceases to be a mother. And so this has been established throughout history in many verses and stories. The idea of the woman becoming kind of the mother of all the family, mother of all the folk, mother of all the nation, or mother of all the gods. And so motherhood is a title that is earned and gained through the sacrifices and the duties that are bore, quite literally and figuratively, from the feminine of the universe, and it all kind of pinnacles under Frigg.
Yeah, I think absolutely everything you just said, and I think it's I know very appropriate for me tonight for this to be the episode that we're talking about. I was thinking about this yesterday. Like I said, it was not unexpected. I'm not, destroyed with grief, but I am contemplative, and it is sad, and been thinking a lot. One of the things that I think is, I don't know, certainly as men, our ambitions are displayed a lot in relationship to our fathers, either in order to impress or in spite of. Whether you had a good father or a bad father, a lot of what you do as a man is a reflection of that. Like, my dad did all these things wrong, so I'm gonna get them all right. I'm gonna do right where he didn't. Or, I'm so proud of my dad, I look up to him so much, I want to make him proud, or I want to surpass something he did. But with mothers, it's very different. You learn through subtle things. It builds your character in terms of the way you treat other people in a lot of ways, in the way you instill a lot of our virtues throughout your life and your family. Place value on your wife, place value on the mother of your children, place value on hospitality and on kindness and compassion and those kind of things. And I know my mother really instilled a lot of that in me. It's interesting the effect mothers have on the raising of men, and certainly of daughters as well. But I think that Frigg, in her matronage of motherhood, is much more accessible to most people than, we talked about, some of the other gods that are focused on more situational things. Or, for example, I'm just thinking of the gods we've gone over, and gods such as Uller or Tyr or Vidar, or gods that are associated with justice and concepts and, winter activities and all these things, are a little bit cerebral. We wouldn't be here if we didn't all come from a mother, and relating to motherhood is something I think it's different throughout our lives. I think when we're young, we can relate to motherhood, as we're the child looking at our mother, whereas as an adult, we can look to our wives, the mothers of our children, and see that in a different way. And I would imagine as an older man looking at our daughters as mothers of their children. I've noticed a number of people over on the side offering their condolences. Thank you for that, guys. I appreciate it. And I'm dumb. I messed up on the date on the little thingy. She passed yesterday, not a month ago. I still thought we were in March for some reason, but that's okay. Got a couple of questions stacking up. We also have a paid donation. Hail Janet Flavel. Hail the mothers. Love the Clausen family. Well, thank you guys. And we certainly appreciate the donation. I'll make sure that goes to good use. If anybody is interested in donating to the AFA this evening, or in participating in super chats, which means we'll, either read your statement or answer your questions before we get to the other ones, you can do that over on Entropy. I know Entropy was down last week. It is back up, and it's a really cool service. If you haven't been over there, I really like it. I like how they do things, and they've been good partners with us. Cool. We just got a $10 donation. All's-Herjar-Gothi Matt and Witan Svan. Can you explain why our 10th noble virtue is victory and its importance to us? Also, condolences, All's-Herjar-Gothi. Hail Janet Flavel, hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the AFA. Thank you very much, Travis. Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to go about why victory is the 10th noble virtue, and I got to take responsibility for that. That one's mine.
That's all you.
That I threw on the list, and here are my thoughts on it for a couple of reasons. I like that it comes at the end of the list of virtues, because the idea being, if you embody those virtues, they should lead towards a goal of being victorious. But the other thing that I think is lost on people in the modern era, and I think is very important to us, is that victory in and of itself was seen by our ancestors and should be seen by us as virtuous. In an authentically religious worldview, your success is a measure of, to a degree, your righteousness or your blessings by the gods. Our ancestors always looked towards a person that was favored by the gods, or a group of people that appeared favored by the gods, because of their continued and perhaps conspicuous victories and successes. The quality of having victory itself be a sign of virtue is, it's inherent to all Aryan cultures that I can recall. That's why we celebrate champions and heroes. And it was a mark of a person's worthiness to lead in many instances in our ancestors' time, was that faith placed in their ability to carry something through and to find success in it. And success is often a sign of favor from the gods, and it's also, determined by people's persistence and their commitment to a goal at all costs, to making things happen and to eking out victories where others would turn back. And that's why it's so important. One of the reasons that I felt it was important to add it on there and to talk about it as much as I do is I think that our folk in this day and age have, to a large degree, lost sight of thinking about winning. I think that a lot of our people are very, very discouraged, and they don't look at the world in terms of what they can achieve, what they can accomplish, what we together can achieve and accomplish. And we need to fix that. So that focus on victory, I think, is really important to us, and it's the reason I put it on that list. Got a couple other questions stacking up. First question. This one came before we were even on the program this evening, from James Autry. Are Black people allowed to join Asatru? Black non-white people are not allowed to join the Asatru Folk Assembly. I suppose a person can practice a faith of their choosing, but whether that practice is accepted by the deities that they're trying to honor or not is a different story. And whether that practice is appropriate or not is a different story. I saw some follow-up over on the his next question is the follow-up. So then he further asks, I don't get it. Is it like a racist thing, or just Black people aren't included? I feel like the gods would want everyone. So it's not about exclusion. It's not about exclusion at all. It's about inclusion of our people. And I can understand some confusion on this. So, and I'm going to take these questions assuming that they're genuine. So that said, certainly in the West, in our culture, we're very used to Christianity and Islam being the biggest religions we're probably familiar with. And those are universal religions. By saying that, they make claims that their God is everyone's God, and that there's one right religion to have, and everything else is sinful and literally the devil. So there's one right path to any appropriate religiosity in those faiths. And that's not the case. I don't believe that's the case in the world in general. It's certainly not the belief of Asatru. We're an ethnic faith, meaning that we're connected to our gods by our very DNA. Our gods are inherent to us as a people, us as a race. And just like our gods are connected to us, the gods of other races are connected to them. And it would be inappropriate for, you use the example of Black people to worship white man gods. I think, if anything, that would be racist. It is much more appropriate for a Black man to worship his Black gods with pride and with dignity in who he is. And same goes for other races of folks as well. And so that's where it's coming from. Svan, do you have anything to add on that at all?
Yeah, I think a lot of the confusion firstly comes from whether obviously race and things of that nature, but when we're talking about race and religion, a lot of people do come from the idea that there is some sort of universal and all-pervading divinity that supersedes nations, supersedes cultures, genetics, everything. Just this overarching kind of global or universal, which is the proper term, but universal in the literal sense of faith. And a lot of people don't. The first hurdle that they have to tackle, whether they are white or black or red or yellow or whatever color, is that the idea of ethnicity with faith. And for some groups, it's easier for us to digest this. If you were, talking to a perhaps like someone in West Africa, or perhaps maybe like an indigenous tribesman or something like that, it would make a lot of sense that their folklore and their stories and things reflect them. They see the divinity, their gods, in direct connection to them. And they set boundaries about where the divinity interacts with them, as opposed to, say, others or things of that nature, or what they might represent in the grand chemistry of everything. So I think that's the biggest problem that a lot of people have to get past. And if they can understand that this applies to groups of people in and at large, and that we as a group promote that all people seek to do this, then it starts to, I think, change the volatility and the hostility of the idea behind it. And so if you don't see that the ability for people to have their ethnic makeup and their language and their culture as definitive parts of their faith, then it's like, are you a universalist? And if you are, then that's something you should contend with, that in reality, no one has any sense of those building blocks being part of the religious makeup. And so that should apply across the board. And when people get kind of posed with that, they suddenly go, I don't think that's right. And it's like, well, congratulations. You're the equivalency of what we use the word is folkish. And so that's our language for it. And that's our, the word in our language for it. So once you come to that, I would always express, when I was in the Marine Corps, I actually was good friends with a gentleman who was part of the motor transport group, and he was Black, and he followed the Yoruban religion from Western Ghana. And his faith and the way he dealt with divinity in the world and all of these things came from his worldview, and that included language and genetics and stories and things like that. And I would never dream of infringing on that. And vice versa, he would never dream of infringing upon ours. And we found, I would say, mutualism in that understanding, because we both were not universalist in our faith. And so a lot of people, when they tackle divinity, try to, well, how can that be? Like, how do gods or a god or divinity, they don't care about race, and they don't care about creed or where you come from, and there's only one overarching thing that, we have to bow down to, or are, like you said, sinful, or to use the Greek word, demonic. I've heard that a lot being tossed around on Twitter. And they fail to realize that the components of the expression of faith is a lot to do with language, but language also has to do with society, and society has to do with race and ethnicity. And those things are all kind of dominoed together. And so it's within, I think, anyone's right on the planet to express and build their relationship with the divine through themselves, through their blood, through the way that they see themselves. How they connect to the divine is the way they correlate directly to themselves and to their neighbors, their family, their friends, and their folk. It's when you get into other things, it's like you see other people and you're like, okay, well, that's their faith, and they deal with the things in there, and I don't want to intercede. I have my own, they have their own. And I think that that's the biggest hurdle. If you can get past that, then we can talk.
Well, and so much of this is a matter of preconceptions, especially in the world we live in today. We're so inundated with things, and race is such a hot button issue. It's been said in recent times that race is a social construct, but on the contrary, society is a racial construct. And I don't think a lot of people are aware of that, but as social groups were forming, they were formed by people with a common culture and a common heritage. And unfortunately, our folk have been demonized lately whenever we want to have any pride in ourselves or any kind of anything's just for us. But if we look at it historically, I think, most people sympathize with the plight of other indigenous people that Christianity or Islam forced to worship their universal religion and destroyed their ethnic faiths. And I think that that's kind of it's not the perspective that I think we see this from enough. But if we looked at it from that perspective, I think we might agree more. And I think that, even if we didn't agree, we might have respect for certainly where we're coming as folkish faiths. I had Nick post a link that he just popped up now as a list of ethnic religions, because this isn't just an Asatru thing, and that's what I wanted people to be aware of with that. When you look at that list, and that's on Wikipedia, and they're certainly no great friend of the Asatru Folk Assembly, but they do point out that these indigenous faiths are a great many around the world. I would say that's the religious norm, up until the massive conquests of Christianity and Islam.
I would also like to point out too that Universalism has a tendency to create that what you started, said is that, there is this kind of everything else is not us, but it's not only just that, it's evil. And so Universalism has a tendency to give the all or nothing caveat based on their faith. You're either with them or you're against them. And I think that a lot of people don't understand that folk faiths there's an understanding that there are other people, there are other things, there are other forces. And what truly makes those things the antithesis against you is their deeds, their actions, the way things are led about. So acting nobly in our faith does extend 100% to our people, but it also exemplifies the deeds we do to anyone else. Is we are noble people, so we will act nobly. And I think that that's a different preset that a lot of people don't think. They think of the political hot button issue, so it's villainous or what have you. And in a lot of ways, the people that are telling you that stuff need it to be that way, to substantiate either their existence or the framework of their ideology, which might be universal, say like in Christianity or Islam, or it might be universal in a political sense, like with perhaps like communalism and things like that. And so these people need desperately to have the outside, evil, demonic, sinful forces to propagate and spread their ideology. And whereas I think for us, we want to keep it within our people. We want our children to know the stories of our ancestors. There's no differentiation between the past to the future. We are part of those building blocks, but we're not trying to step that into other people's lives. And I think that a lot of people at least find that as one of the greatest misunderstandings of our faith, especially from the Asatru folk assembly. Because the way he posited the question was in Asatru, and again, you said very well, is that the Asatru folk assembly allows us to create our inner guard, which is a very important factor in our faith. And all peoples can define themselves by their titles, or some churches and things like that will define themselves based on who they try to bring into their congregations, whether it's economically or linguistically or what have you. People do it all the time. Ours is based on those 4 precepts of really is the culture, the heritage, the ethnicity, and the language. But the language one is even more along the lines of, I think, our ancient language, whether it's Germanic or Italic, and ultimately the unifying language that all of our people once spoke of. But that's something further on and in.
So, King of Cheese is not with us tonight because he's having a cable outage, but he got a message through to one of his folk builders to be sure to, I appreciate the commitment on that. Tony seems
determination.
Awesome guy. I really look forward to meeting him. Yep, but he wants to ask his question. He asks us every week is, gentlemen, how are we doing this evening? Svan, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. It's if anybody's following the Iron Mark, it's auspicious. Tonight is the first night of summer month. It's the full moon. It's the summer moon. We're moving towards Merry Moon and the May Day, and so we're getting up to midsummer. So it's really, really exciting. It's a great time. It's really nice to. I don't know, for a lot of folks maybe further west right now, they're hitting the evening tide of the day. But for me over here, it's warm, and it's starting to get that kind of balmy feeling of the summer in the air, and the moon, bright and full, and everything's. I feel very connected to it all. So, doing great.
Yeah, Tony, it's a mixed bag. I'm excited to be here on Victory Never Sleeps, talking with everybody. I look forward to this every week. Honestly, doing pretty good. A lot of stuff's going great, but I am saddened by my mother's recent passing, and just doing a lot of thinking about things that way, and taking stock and reflecting on some things. But nothing bad, just kind of somber, but doing pretty well. I appreciate you asking. Our next question is worded in a way I have not heard before. Is Vril the Wanderer watching right now? Love your output. What are your thoughts, Svan?
Oh no, I think he's talking about Vril the Wanderer in the comment section. So a lot of folks might not know too that there's like the comment section's pretty. It's awesome, and it can get. There's a lot of like banter and joking and people saying hello. They're also asking like, hey, where have you been? Like a lot of times they communicate to each other via our show. So this is amazing. And a lot of the input, sometimes it gets heated. I think there's arguments too, but hopefully within Frigg, they keep, it's perfectly fine to have different opinions, but but yeah, he's asking about Vril.
Oh, well then that makes it make a lot more sense. Yeah, I have no idea. I'm unfamiliar with who that is. I don't recognize his name from the chat room, but so often I'm focused on other things and I can't pay as much attention to the chat room as I would like. So that takes away a lot of the
yeah.
I threw that at Svan because I was like, what's he talking about? I wanted to
well, and I had saw some of that stuff out, like Ian, good friend of mine. Last I saw or heard of him, he was living in Texas. Good guy. And he said, guys, I can't stay on. I just wanted to say hello, but I got to go to bed. I got to work in the morning. So it was really cool. I love the comment section. It's great. There's a lot of great people out there putting tons of great input. I wish we could
really
drop everyone.
The fact that there's so much activity in the comment section is really warms my heart. Good, bad, or otherwise, it's great for everybody to be over there talking and meeting each other on this. I think that's been a really positive thing about the program. So this is interesting. I think there's, infinite ways we could go with this, but from Jennifer and Justin Young, can we get homework, something to study on and put into our everyday life? So I've got some thoughts, but Svan, do you have any ideas of some stuff folks could do for homework that would, could be done and impactful to their everyday life?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I always talk about this at the Hoff, is build your faith drive. So, or basically exercise your mind and your heart and your body all at the same time through building faith. And that is what we call a bloat. It comes from the old word meaning to blood. So I would say start giving bloat now. And yes, there is right ways, or perhaps even more correct ways of doing things, but the ultimate right way is to do it. So, even if that comes down to gathering pictures of your ancestors, because all of us can gather, or traces back somewhere in some way. Maybe you don't know any of actual named ancestors, but you might know where your people come from, or like lands that they may have lived in before. There's lots of ways that you can build connectivity, and it could be something quite as simple as lighting a candle to them, and praying to them, and then offering them a drink by sharing it with them, and then placing it within a receptacle, one that is not just like a bowl is usually what we use, but that bowl becomes dedicated to this process. So, speaking their names out loud. This is the hardest part, is the time in between lighting that candle and pouring or drinking the drink is where a lot of people, I think, fall not short, but they just kind of get lost. And one of the things that's worth considering is just speaking out loud, speaking their names, telling their stories, even if it's like, I just learned about you and I went on the internet and I found these pages and I found this out, and telling your emotional and mental thoughts out into the air while, looking upon a picture of your ancestors, and then, maybe choosing something very special, a drink that you're not going to drink the entirety of. So, something, even if you bought it, doesn't matter, or you made it, and you pour it into a cup and you drink it, and then you pour the rest into the bowl, and then you thank your ancestors for guiding you, or ask for guidance. That's, and blessings. And if you're found worthy, you ask it, hey, if you believe that I am worthy of your love and your guidance, please, I'm open and I'm ready and I'm willing. And then you take that offering and you place it somewhere outside. You're pouring it out someplace that usually people find, like a tree or something that's notable, and then they clean up and kind of move from there. And I would say that's one of the best things to do, is that homework of physical practice. As you go, you will learn more. But if you don't learn how to initiate your conversation with the divine and with the spiritual world, I think that a lot of people end up in the long run having to climb that hurdle later. And a lot of times it can be obfuscated with details and steps and things like that. If you can learn all of that and become finely tuned, but it all is based on the fuel you put in you, and that fuel is that initiation of faith.
Yes, Svan answered that pretty comprehensively. I don't really have anything to add. I think, those are the things that I would have suggested. And I think that with any of that, please keep in mind not to let perfect be the enemy of good. All these things grow over time. There's some people that have elaborate and amazing and beautiful altars where they do their worship at. It's also really, really good just to sit and put a candle on a shelf and start there. You don't need the world's most elaborate altar to start worshiping our gods. You don't need to have composed the most beautiful poem to honor them with. Just speaking from your heart to your gods is a powerful thing in and of itself, and it all has to start somewhere. So, the time is now. Katie asks, good evening, gentlemen. What are some ways that we can celebrate the upcoming months if we are unable to make it to the Hofs? So, a couple of different things to this question. First, if you can make it to the Hofs, that's awesome. If you can't, one thing that is really special about the AFA and all of the growth that we've had in the last few years is there's a chance that you may very well have AFA members very close to you. So I think that, all effort should be given to trying to practice our faith in a community amongst other Asatru. If you find yourself alone with just your family, there's plenty of things you can do depending on the holiday as far as, activities or whatnot. Absolutely. With each of our holidays, you could do your own personal bloat like Svan just talked so eloquently about. But it's very special that even if you do go and celebrate the holidays at the Hof, that you do something and you observe our holy tides in your home as well. If it's you and your family, even if it's you by yourself, things you can do around your house to decorate, make it special and celebrate, that literally brings it home. And it instills tradition in families and in children. And the more we can do with that, the better. What are your thoughts, Svan, on ways folk that can celebrate our upcoming holidays if they're unable to make it to the Hofs?
Well, one thing to remember is right now is it's summertime, so the bounty and the beauty of the world around you is to be celebrated. So honoring the Aus and Ausinir, or gods and goddesses of this time, is good. So celebrating little things. It could be something as simple as if you go out with your children to a festival, flowering festival. I know they just had one recently here where I was at. And the idea of spending time with your family, taking that moment, even if you're not doing like an actual, like ceremonial placement, but taking that moment to give thanks to your ancestors, to give thanks to the gods, and then go home and do that. Light a candle, share a libation, because the deep symbolic sense of sharing the liquid between yourself to your ancestors and to the gods during this time, in thanks of the turning of the seasons. Some of the Aus and Ausinir to look at around this time in particular, of course, is the Lord Frey and the Lady, or Freya. A lot of folks right now are turning their minds towards that. Though, to be honest, Lord Frey is very much the summer tides season. He's the Aus we often pray to. From Charming of the Plough all the way to Frey Faxi, he is the Varalta god. He's the god of the world right now, and he is the blooming and the light, and his retinue of Leo Salvar are busy instigating growth. So a lot of times giving thanks to Frey is, I would say, a good starting point if you need one. But all, whether you want to, hey, I heard about, like, if you speaking to the divine, of course, with reverence, but I heard about you at Victory Never Sleeps, so I would like to give thanks to you, Lady Frigg, and then and hold a ceremony to Lady Frigg. It's all within kind of what you're willing and able to do. I think the biggest thing is come at it with a point of reverence. But our faith is not necessarily like separate from our lives. It's pervading. And so you would look at a bloat as like we're physically doing something, because a big part of our faith is about combining our thoughts with our deeds. And so physically weaving yourself into the time of the year is very important. That's why a lot of our holidays are based on the tidings of the year. But it doesn't have to be only that. I mean, anytime that you want to, simply, again, cross that threshold. That's the hurdle that a lot of people have, is where they feel that they're going to do something wrong or do something foolish. And the best route to go about is to, open your mind and your heart to the gods or to your ancestors. I say the ancestors a lot because I know for a lot of folks approaching the gods, which should be, this is the case, I think, it should be the case, is that you want to approach the gods with a little bit more gravity to understanding and building that relationship with them. But we do have a very clear connection to our ancestors right away. So in a lot of ways, building your connection to your ancestors is a way to help further in building your relationship to the eldest of your ancestors, which are the gods. So that's why I keep saying that. But yeah, the one thing that's really hard about this time of year is built around community. It always has been. So the big holiday that's coming up now is the Night of the Witches, Hexanacht, and there's a lot of confusion around that. And a lot of times it's built around the people coming out of their houses right now. Our folk were coming out of their homes, their farmlands. They were getting on the roads and they were starting to walk to each other or ride to each other or take a wagon. Or there's a lot of movement that started right around this time of year. And the big thing was the preparation of the ground, the preparation of the seed, the preparation of your equipment, and blessings, asking the gods to bless our folk, to bless the livestock when they go out and past the the guard, past the hedges, out into the fields. So Hexanacht was born from that, and so too was May Day. And so both of these holidays are really built around community. Anybody that's going to be unable to get to the Hofs are going to see the maypoles coming out, and that's something as a standard or a banner of testament to the fact that there's a large group of people coming together to dance around the maypole. And for many years I did not have that, many years. So I totally understand where you're coming from by if you're unable to make it or you don't have anyone around you. And so oftentimes this time of year, I would pray to Freya, I would pray to Frey, I would give thanks and ask for protection, and I would give thanks for all the bounty. I would do things by like placing gifts. I think that's another threshold that a lot of people have to understand is getting through, is our sense of giving physical items as a devotional act, and giving the spirit of something is really integral to our faith. So even if it was placing loaves of bread into a hole that I dug, and then pouring wine on top of that, and then placing the dirt and just giving thanks. There's little things you can do. There's no starting out, there's really nothing that should hold you back. You shouldn't be thinking that you're going to go the wrong direction. As you do get more experience, though, and if you do have an ability to go to the Hofs, one of the best things about the Hofs are that when you go there, you get to see kind of like the faith at large, and you get to see some of the tenets and some of the processes that we do, and you can then carry those home. But you could emailing a folk builder, emailing a Gothar and asking them, hey, what can I do? Or is there anybody in my area? But if you're, by yourself or with family, definitely, celebrate the season. Make flower crowns with your kids. Bake bread or make a dish and then gift that, or a part of it at least. That could be, anything from a loaf of bread to wine to flowers to fruit and all of these things, because the acts of what you're doing are part of the devotion. That's what I tell people at Thorshoff. It's like the very fact that you got on the road and started out this morning traveling to us, that's all part of the devotional process. And so it starts small, and it starts with you just doing little things and trying to build more into that.
All right. Next question is an interesting one. Sarah asks, does Frigg not like her other children, Hother and Hermother? And I think that's a really interesting one. I'm not sure if you have theories or ideas on this, Svan.
Is that the entirety of the question? I didn't see it come up.
Yeah.
I certainly don't think that she has malice or hatred, especially if we're talking about Hother. I would say sadness and the great sense of loss. But when we're talking about the gods in like I think in the calls before that we've done, we talked about euhemerism and humanizing the gods, and I think that we do that to a certain sense in our stories, especially to better understand. Again, it's another way for us to understand the divine. And one of the things I have a tendency to see the gods outside of the stories solely, and see, to me, Frigga is the epitome of motherliness, motherhood. And I can't speak for her, but I would feel that a mother would not hold that level of malice, especially when your hand was guided by someone who you trusted. And that's another reason why in the Asatru Folk Assembly, we do not abide the devotional kind of I don't even know what it would be called. Can't even find the word for it, for Loki, or we call him the Kinslayer, because again, Hov was tricked by hand. He was tricked by the one that was trusted. And if we're talking about the stories again, and we're talking about them as you kind of euhemerizing them just a little bit, Loki plighted against Hod with utilizing a weakness, his inability to see. And even beyond that, not fully even knowing the entirety of the story about the green and leafy, the innocence of the mistletoe. But if you look outside, now let's break it back out again. What we're seeing is one brother is tricked to slay another brother with something that seems innocent, much like a good intention or an abidement of that which is good. And you can see that in our world today amongst the folk. There are many people who would readily attack their fellow brothers and sisters based on the idea that they are abiding by some grand virtue. And that virtue is what they see is innocence, but they don't realize it's the key to causing such great pain and misery, and ultimately dissipating the start of the dissipation of that which is orderly. So it's so funny to me. I often think about it as like the dissipation of order amongst the cosmic gods of law is the innocent mistletoe. But it's not the mistletoe itself. It's everything surrounding it. The ignorance of the brother, the maliciousness of the outsider, and the connivingness of the outsider, the embitterment that he held. And then ultimately the subsequent things that follow from there. Now with Hermod, that's an interesting one. I don't recall anywhere in the stories where that's even inclined. Hermod is the name, the etymology of the name means battle strength. And the story is kind of placed as a unique, I think, poetic switch, because we don't see it elsewhere, and we know that Lord Odin has gone down to the underneath, the place separated from time, the place beyond the veil, the place beyond the cave, Nipa cave. And so, in this sense, it's that he was so bestricken by grief that he could not, and so one of his sons, Hermod, took the mission up for his father. There's a lot of theories about Hermod as well, but from the stories, his son takes his horse and rides to see his brother, and sees it. And if you're reading all of the stories, it's known that Odin knows where he is. Odin knows where he resides. Odin knows the process, but the idea that the battle strength that is needed by even the great god Odin to convey the message to one of the outs that has shifted from one place where the gods reside to the ultimate separation, where it's very hard, I think, for the gods, and it's the place away from time, it's a place away from the material. And it seems throughout the stories consistently remarked that it's a great deed for the gods to transcend that threshold and go down into that place, and that primordial place. And so his son does. And I don't think there's any indication in anywhere that I could think of in which perhaps Frigg would even have the inclination, or it wasn't mentioned anywhere. But I feel in my heart that Frigg is the epitome of the feminine, and of the virtue feminine, of the power of within culture, within society. She's the queen, she is the mother, she has so much to uphold, that, and in great wisdom, she would never even entertain the idea of malice, but would hold great sadness. And that's referred to as well. And her dedication to protecting her son Balder is noted as well. So protection and lament.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I'm not sure what prompts the question about her mother. Because not only does she not, dislike, but it was mentioned, one of the, in a way, the reward for him going and being the messenger of the gods to beseech hell to release Balder was, Frigg offered, she tried to get any of the Aesir to go. And she said, if anyone would win my love and my favor, I think my everlasting love and favor, who would do this for me? And he was the one who went and did it. So I think that she certainly, holds her mother in high regard. As far as Hodor goes, I don't presume to speak for Frigg in this regard. What I will say is that in the story, in the lore, it actually in the Gylfaginning, where we get our list of the 12 gods of the 12 Aesir that we are constructing our Hofs to, his name is mentioned in a list of Aesir, but it's said that the gods don't want even anyone to mention his name because the memory of what happened to Balder is so painful that by acknowledging Hother, they're reminded of that pain. So I can't say that she does have fond feelings of him or not, and I think that's I don't know. It's not for me to say. But what I will say that I think this illustrates in an interesting way is that to our ancestors, like the worst thing that could happen is strife amongst kinsmen and the slaying of one family member by another. Because when someone outside of your family wrongs you, you can take vengeance and your family can be compensated for the loss that it suffered in some way. But when it's people in your own house that are taking from one another, there's no way to recoup that loss, because further punishing your own kin for something that they did to a kinsman of yours just continues to diminish the might and the Hamenya of your family. And there was no resolution and no right answer to those questions. And that's why being a kinslayer was such a powerful transgression amongst our ancestors, and why this situation is particularly tragic. And I think that's what elevates the level of this tragedy in such a mythic scale. And so I don't presume to say that what Frigg might or might not feel about Hother, but I think that she's absolutely a Hermother fan. That's attested to in the lore, and he daringly braves situations that others fear to do in order to secure her love and her favor. So I think that's well earned.
I would like to even say, because something that you have mentioned before in our conversations, which are always really insightful, is when you talk about Odin being the god of consciousness for the folk. I often try to apply that understanding to all things, bigger pictures, patterns, and the way things that they lay out, and whether you hemorize the gods as human in a mythical sense, or I try to say avoid the literal, but in the mythical sense. But also too, if Odin is the god of consciousness and Frigg is, then I would say, the heart, or the wisdom and the spiritual guidance as the core of the folk, and of course Balder is the consciousness. Then in a lot of ways, the consciousness was slayed by ignorance at the hand of the deceiving outsider, and it takes a lot of Hermoth battle strength for us to regain that. So if we're talking about the soul of the people, or we're talking about the soul of the self, Hermoth definitely represents the consciousness and the heart, and the great strength that it takes in order to reach down and rekindle and relight the soul of that's in the darkness. So there's a lot of allegoric sense that can be there. It takes great strength. If someone is in a point where their mind and their heart are completely devoid of light and they're falling into this dark place, it takes great battle strength to reach down, to go low into themselves and pull that light out of that darkness. So, and I think Hermoth kind of represents that strength, that's in his name. It represents that, whether it's we're applying it to the folk, or whether we're applying it to the individual, or of course ultimately to the gods.
So next question is from Rachel, still catching up on the video, so I'm minutes behind, but wondering why we do not celebrate Sigrblot tonight, the full moon in April. You're welcome. Go ahead, Svan.
Oh, in April.
Yeah, so I was going to say, by all means, you're welcome to do that if you'd like. The reason that the AFA doesn't do that is a couple of things. So first, there are a number of our holy days that are based on nature. The equinox happen when the equinox happens. The solstices happen when the solstices happen. But there's other of our celebrations that aren't so tied to a natural cycle. And Sigrblot was one of those. It was celebrated in a particular time, and the attestation that we have is during the Viking Age, where this is the time of year where stuff is thawed enough that they could go and start mounting their raids for raiding season. And that was very specific to a certain geographical instance as opposed to a larger natural truth. But the truth of that was to have a celebration, to celebrate victory, to beseech the gods to bless them with victory, and to instill victory amongst the folk by sharing in a communal context. And that's something that we do still do as the Asatru Folk Assembly, but we've chosen to do that in July. So in constructing the modern AFA calendar, it was very important for us to have a monthly focus and a monthly ritual for folks to do. And we can certainly do more than that, but at the very least, we want to celebrate one of our religious functions every month, to get our folk together to worship the gods together, to get our folk to come to the Hof and worship the gods together, or even just meet up with their fellow AFA members and celebrate a bloat. We want folks to do that at least once a month. July was the month that we didn't have something, and April was a month that we did. And what was happening was we had Hexennacht at the very end of April, at the 30th of April. And then on the 1st of May, we had May Day. And so rather than celebrate those two things differently, what we would have is, because they were, directly next to each other, people would get together and celebrate one and not the other. And so one of those very important holy celebrations was always left out. The other thing that we'd see is sometimes, in order to do that, they wouldn't celebrate Sigrblot this time of year because that wasn't a for sure in stone thing. They would celebrate May Day instead of Hexennacht because they're kind of both together and they didn't really know what to do for Hexennacht. So then both of those important celebrations would get skipped. What we do now is we try to separate Hexennacht and May Day unless you're able to celebrate them over the weekend. If you're able to have an overnight and celebrate the one on one day and then the next following it on a separate day, that's great. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing it. That's probably the ideal if you can. But to facilitate monthly worship at our Hofs, we separate those by a month to where Hexennacht can get its full focus and its full attention it deserves, and May Day can get the full focus and attention that it deserves, and it can still happen sequentially. And then also to facilitate us getting together once a month. And, July is kind of a fun month to do it because it's during that high period of summer where things are vibrant and alive, and it's a fun time to celebrate victory and to talk about victories. And because we experience victory in, certainly us in the United States in 2023 celebrate victory in a very different way than we would have if we were in the middle of, medieval or pre-medieval warfare, to where we needed to wait for the ice to thaw for us to go and engage in any of the struggles we engage in. We're seeking victory all year long, so there's not really a bad time to celebrate a Sigrblot. Svan, do you have any more to add on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of what you said is the groundwork of understanding. I think that a lot of people might get confused or think that we're trying to do something, but your openness about it, about what we were doing and what we were intending, is because cultural evolution. You know, the 12 Aus, we have 12 months, so we have, you know, and set up things devotionally within the Hof. Sigrblot was one of those holidays that very much are like Alvarblot and Dísarblot. Now, we have attestments to this in Iceland, and we have a general idea. Our ancestors saw at the beginning of winter, because of the two tidings, before before midwinter, excuse me, Yule, Dísarblot was generally held. And sometime in around February, Alvarblot was held. But the entirety of our faith is not strictly just the Icelandic evolution of their tidings at that time, that snapshot. So there's a lot of room that needs to be made for certain things. And also, too, Asatru has kind of evolved since the 70s on its own, incorporating certain things, even down to like Hexanacht, or you know, like in Sweden and stuff, it's sometimes referred to as like Valsberganacht, and that, you know, extends into Germany and things of that nature. Sigrblot was one of those. It was one of those holy tides that fell right around in between during Ostra, or, you know, during Hexanacht and May Day. And so a lot of people didn't know, and we already had Ostra, and Ostra has such a vibrant connection to our people, especially here in America and in England, because these traditions have long been established. You know, even with overarching Christian culture. And so the eggs and the celebration of Ostra was one that we naturally gravitated towards, but not losing Sigrblot in mindset. And so it's one thing worth noting that right around in the middle of the summer, oftentimes there were great moots or Althingers, or like meetings in which the folk got together to celebrate, you know, the first half of their harvests, to get together and hold, you know, they were crafting things and selling things, and law was discussed. And so there was a lot of stuff going on at that time. So it was, again, like Asatru, they said, it was a great time to view as this is a time when our folk are getting together both in the past and in the present, and it's a great time to celebrate our victories and to focus ourselves towards the end of the harvest time, and to also gird ourselves towards the eventual, you know, falling of the year into the winter tiding. So Sigrblot, instead of it being, you know, X'd out, it was brought over. And again, when I was when coming into Asatru back in the early 90s, I did see this, like kindreds and groups. Some of them celebrated Ostra, some of them celebrated Sigrblot, some of them did Hexanacht, but couldn't make May Day because they couldn't have people over for overnight or scheduling, because the Gregorian calendar, May 1st, falls sometimes on a weekday. So it caused a lot of logistic issues as well. And so sometimes those holidays would get kind of diffused or interlaced and things. So we, you know, bringing them apart and focusing on the season of, you know, May Day and the flowers, but also too, April's time frame was the time which the herdsmen were starting to get prepared to head out into the wild, and they were going to face chthonic forces. And I think, you know, Hexanacht is one of those holidays that a lot of people are very, very, they don't have a lot on that. And that's unfortunate, because this is the time in which our women folk bless the men and the children and protect them with their love, with their weirding way, with their magic, the magic that was passed down from our ancestors, whether it's, you know, through herbs and lore and spell. And these women, you know, creating sacred fire and the smoke, you know, blessing us as we begin our approach into the summer, I think is really, really important. And it kind of gives a glimpse to a cultural thing that a lot of people don't think about. the chthonic forces that we talk about, of course, in the Old Norse, they were often referred to as like troll riding witches and giants or trolls that that were malicious and, you know, out on the edges of things. And our ancestors knew that. They saw that kind of that visceral hatred, the kind of the almost like the anti-mother energy out there, the thing that pulls the family apart or pulls the clan apart or pulls the tribe or the nation apart. And it was seen as, no, this is a time for the women folk to protect their people, and as they start to head out. And so there's a lot to it that has evolved both modernly and pulling from sources of the past. And so I think it's becoming a transitional state that a lot of the folk are accepting as soon as especially once they understand what's going on and what our intentions are. And our intentions are always built on piety, devotion, and making sure that everything is covered well and culturally feasible. So logistics and things of that nature are always kind of considered as well when it comes to families and kindreds and the temples. So that would be the reason. I mean, Alcira they dead just straight out covered it. That's why we did it. But yeah, there's a lot to it as we evolve.
All right, our next question. I've been very interested in learning more about the folk mother lately. This episode about Frigg seems like a good chance to ask, where can I learn more about our folk mother, Elsie Christensen? Svan, do you have a good suggestion on that?
Oh, there's definitely, I mean, one of our Hawks is directly connected to. Every Hoff has kind of a patron or a matron, a hero that it's dedicated to. And it's really good that Baldur's Hoff has a lot of connectivity to Elsa Christensen and her contributions and her coming to understanding the gods and then spreading it to her people, even under, you know, a lot of external and divisive forces. So first and foremost, I would say Baldur's Hoff's website is a great place. There's a lot of again, the internet is wonderful as well. Again, you have to pick and piece through, and there could be, you know, forces that are of dissipation that you might run into, but again, you will be guided. You know, even holding honor to her and asking for that guidance is perfectly within the realm of our faith. So, you know, there's, whether you're talking about personal experiences, a lot of people, you know, have written down what their interactions, her struggle and her plight, and even, you know, some of the things that she endured are readily available there as well. Yeah, when it comes to Frigg and her epitome of motherhood, there is too the point of the goddess, the mother, her standing up for her people, her holding her chest up, her chin up, and being a bearer of what is right versus what is wrong. And sometimes it takes the feminine to ignite that again, like with the dichotomy between Frigg and Hermod, is that the folk men should look at the women as the bestowing of that by their standards, by their what they believe is right and wrong, and the menfolk will naturally look to that and want to achieve, supersede, and make the women of their folk look proudly upon them. So a lot of that power is in Frigg, is about, you know, when Odin goes out, she may give counsel and say, I don't think that's wise, but if you are drawn to do it, then come back safely. And so she gives counsel, and she promotes the instigation of gaining title. And I think a lot of that is represented both in Frigg and in Elsa Christensen?
This is one thing that is unfortunate, and it's something behind the scenes that the AFA is really working on, is compiling more of our history. A lot of these people live very important, very meaningful lives, but then when you want to find out more and you want to find out about these great people, it's often hard to get a lot of information. I would suggest, that about going on Baldershoff website, absolutely. Sarah Alt is going to come on this program when we get to Elsie in our Heroes episodes, and I think that'll happen sometime next month, and we'll be able to talk a little bit about her. What I'd suggest, if you can, is if you can get in touch with old timers that knew her and interacted with her, that's a really good way to learn about Elsie. I never had the honor of interacting with her myself, but I've been able to speak to some folks who have. So I think finding ways to talk to people who knew her is a good way to do that. I think getting real stories from real people is always the best if you have the availability. And her, living so close to our time, we're still able to get some of that information, which is awesome. Next question is for you specifically, Svan. Is there anything to the overlap of attributes of Freya and the attributes of Frigg?
Yeah, I think that first and foremost, before we go down this road, there is a lot of confusion about this subject, and there's no shortage of opinions on this as far as things go. But the Asatru Folk Assembly looks upon divinity in its plurism, in its multiplicity, if you will. And so we do not hypostasis or mash the gods together. We don't say that Ostara is really, just not the goddess of night amongst the Nords. We don't say that, that perhaps Nerthus of the ancient Germans is really just this other goddess, and then that goddess is just a hypostasis of this goddess. So we don't bunch. We have a tendency to look at the exceptionalism between them. And that's the first and foremost drive. Outside of that, we do see a lot of overlap. Obviously the strength of femininity within, and we're most likely going to cover Freya in a separate episode. So I don't want to go too much, but the biggest thing I would say is the femininity is the clear overlap. The representations of their domains within the lives of the folk, especially in relation to the woman. But whereas Frigga represents a kind of escalation into societal strata, into the obligations of oath and of marriage. And that is a big focus around Frigg. And a lot of people, might say, oh, what do you mean obligation? What do you mean this or that or what have you? Is that it's clear in our society that men and women, when they reach a certain point in their life, escalate themselves into the integral workings of the community. I think now things are atomized, that a man is a father, a woman is a mother, and they might be only unto themselves as a family, but that wasn't always the way it worked. Is father and mother is very much like a title. It's a threshold. And again, any person that is a parent knows this threshold, knows this interconnectivity. It's something as simple as when you see a parent struggling with a child and they're just throwing a fit, and you look across there and you're like, I totally get it. As opposed to perhaps somebody who's doesn't have a child, isn't obligated or duty bound in their life to the community, to their family, or to other people. And so Freya, in essence, represents the internalized feminine, and Frigga is the external. And at the same time, They also represent how the external becomes receptive and the internal becomes projective. That's a very strange dichotomy for a lot of people to wrap their heads around. But I think it's the best way to look at when one projects themselves out into society, when they become duty bound by oath to another, when they become duty bound to perhaps a higher calling of the folk, or to by blood through children, what is required is that they have already kind of projected themselves outwards, and now it is a time to integrate themselves within the understanding. You'll notice this right away. First-time mothers, first-time children, they might immediately start asking their mother, their grandparents, friends about things. My child has a blocked tear duct. What do I do? And so going, sometimes nowadays, because things are atomized, people will go online, and that's information is good. Again, you just have to pick through it. But when that woman she's projected herself into the strata of things. I don't know if I was lost. Oh, sorry. Okay. So I don't know if you guys could hear me when that happens. The idea of being receptive but also being projected out into society is you are being watched, you're being looked at, both men and women in that point of your life. You have to be a pinnacle of being the moral bedrock during tragedy, and also a lot of people are looking at the way you project yourselves into the world, but you also have to be very receptive to the people around you. Guidance is a big thing. So I think Frigga represents that, whereas Freya is about galvanizing the self of the feminine. I think the biggest thing is, and it's a huge problem within our society, is that the determinant of worth. I think that people often misview Freya as being some determinant of worth only around sexuality. And I think that's a grave, grave mistake. I think that's modernism kind of injecting itself into things. We see it, on the masculine, but we're talking about the feminine now. And the application of simply basing self-worth around perhaps seeing Frigga or euhemerizing Frigga as some sort of just carnal based only is, I think, it's misguided, because the accusations from the enemies that have been levied towards Freya are the ones saying that. So placing stock in the accusation over the god or goddess themselves, I think is not the right path to go, but to look at other things like the tendance and discipline of worth, the understanding that the femininity and the desire from the masculine to the feminine, and the composure of that worth. Numerous times you see Freya as being this object to be desired from an outside source, and she continually says, no, I will not partake in any of this. Or she gets rageful because she has, in essence, the determinant of worth internally to say no. And so that is that standard building. I think like young men who look upon women and want to gain their affections, they understand this the most when the woman says, and again, we do this during like the May Day, when the men folk are carrying the maypole, they ask, may they place the pole to start the ceremony, and the women always state a standard, a point in which they expect the men that they are mingling with, that they are interacting with, be men of virtue, men of backbone, men of character, men of the desire for glory, and all of those things. That's very important in the realm of Freya. Frigga has already crossed that threshold. Frigg knows the character of that which she has duty bound herself to, the union there. So she, I think represents two sides of or they both represent, the overlap is the admixture of femininity within nature. As far as lore and things go, there's a lot of confusion because there's mention of Freya being married to a divine power named Other. And Other and Odin, obviously, very, very close in linguistic etymology, especially around the ideals of fury and of inspiration. And there's a lot of stuff, and I think we would cover some of that more in Freya's episode. But that's, I think, a big part of the overall mystery of Freya that is not, it's been solved in Frigg. Frigg has attained the understanding. She has attained the connection. And she, in her own right, has, determined the way she learns of the information about the goings on in the world. She has the handmaidens, the maidens of Fensaler, the goddesses that implement all of the powers that she presides over within our society. Freya is more connected to, in particular, a type of death and psychopomp functionality within our culture, especially around the corpus of battle. And that is not, so there's a lot more, I would say, distinction between the two than there is a huge overlap. Other than that, I would say, Frigg is born of the earth. It is said that she is born of the earth, and she is born of the mountain. She is born of, the interesting thing is the writing down of her parentage is very limited, but it is mentioned in both the masculine and the feminine form. So a lot of folks have taken that to be the twinning or the coupling of the earth, both in the masculine and the feminine. So that would, of course, gear our minds towards the Vanir, especially when you see this in Frey and Freya, or you see this in Njord or Nerthus, or Jord or Norrön, as she may have been called at one point. You see this coupling, the masculine and feminine, connected to the earth and the water. So I would say the greatest overlap that I would like to point out is that our folk should understand that Frigga does source herself from the same place as Freya, but that she came after the unification of the gods, after cosmic order and natural law aligned themselves. It was at that moment, which again isn't hugely covered in the poetics because again, poems are limited in their scope. After the gods created that union between each other, she came about and made union with Odin. Odin, and her linked. There's very little about a sense of the courtship of that and things. But there is reference a lot to again, the naysay, the accusations against both Freya and Frigga. So there's an overlap there. I think in the poems, Loki, and even in some of the sagas, there's accusations. But again, you're looking at Loki, the outsider, the betrayer, the kinslayer, because bound in blood. But you also see it with like Saxo Grammaticus, who was a Christian who hated the old faith, but yet wrote about the origins of the Danes and used a ton of the lore, but he euhemerized the gods into literal humans, and he accused Frigg of being promiscuous as well. And so I think one thing that's worth noting is both with Freya and with Frigg, the idea of promiscuity is something that our ancestors, when they were hearing the story, when the accusation was leveled, was seen negative. And that tells a lot about the feminine in our society, even in olden days. To be accused of being promiscuous was seen as not a good thing. And that's because, in reality, it's showing a woman who lacks her understanding of self-worth or worth within society. And I think that's the biggest problem. And that overlap is there. The accusation of promiscuity towards Frigg and the accusation of promiscuity towards Freya are all placed with a negative context. And I think that lends to knowing that societally our ancestors saw that as a negative thing. The feminine understanding its worth internally and understanding its worth externally, the feminine power, the feminine energy of our tribe and of our nation was seen as that it needed to determine worth because it could be, that was the thing that was attacked. So I think there's overlap there as well. And I think it's kind of also a common trope that's utilized when somebody of anti or malicious intent or anti-cohesion will target the feminine immediately and start to try to dissipate from there. So there's overlap in there as well. I think if reading the lore and stuff, you can definitely find that there.
So Sarah asks, how did our ancestors treat the elderly of their tribe? And I think this is
that's a great question.
Well, it's an interesting question because when people say, how did our ancestors do X, especially on this program, very often we talk about, the arch Asatru period of, the Viking Age or before. But up until very, very recently, our ancestors and, most all people of worth treated their elders with a great amount of reverence and respect for a number of different reasons. I think that in a fundamental way, living long, and especially the harder life was, reaching an advanced age was an accomplishment in and of itself. But an elder, a number of things. So, and that's an obvious one. Another very obvious one is the amount of life experience and wisdom that they've gained through all of their time and all of their years. And in another way that I think maybe is less thought about, our elders are our literal link to the past. I said a minute ago, if you want to know more about Elsie or the heroes of days gone by, you ask some old timers, and they can tell you about the good old days. They can tell you about the generations that preceded you. So that wisdom's not lost. So those stories don't die. So you learn the wisdom of the past. But no, the wisdom and experience of our elders was celebrated, and linguistically. That's why there's an overlap between to worship something being to venerate it, and something of great age being referred to as venerable. Because we celebrated that as a people. And, in the AFA, we still do that today. In my parents' generation, you were hyper respectful to your elders. I think it's only in my generation and the generation that's come since that that has not been the norm in Western culture. And that's disgraceful and something we aim to fix. Do you have something to add on that, Svan?
Yeah, I was going to say at what time, because, we were talking about like the evolution of our holidays, our holy tides, and how things kind of evolve. Well, our ancestors had an evolution of lots of things, especially dealing with people in their latter stages of life, the silver ages, the golden ages of their lives. Sometimes very, very harsh, the nature of our lives, especially during like the migration period and things like that. So I immediately want to push the glasses up and say, well, at what time, let's talk about this time, Bronze Age, migration period, and all the way through. I think overall, the respect towards the elderly was always seen in a sense of both care, a folk that had elderly women, mothers, that have become grandmothers or mothers of the people, that was a sign and a testament to the security of the menfolk, that they had the ability to have elderly women in the halls that were there teaching the young girls how to do things and to learn from things. And oftentimes that was at the sacrifice of their menfolk. And so, a lot of times the menfolk would go out and defend and fight and do things. And so a lot of times it was the mother that was a testament to the security of the people. So I definitely think, whether we talk about ancient or even like I'm here in the South, and it doesn't matter really who the person is, and it really doesn't always even matter the type of life they may have lived. But when they reach a certain age, there is a heavy level of respect to the person, at least given initially until they wash that away or give reason for there not to be there. The immediate go-to is to respect that age because of the wisdom that they've gained, and perhaps and hopefully the self-reflection that they have, or again, as a reminder of the frailty of our brief existence here in the long line of all of our ancestors, and that we too will become ancestors one day ourselves. Respecting our elders, and trying to care for them in the best way that we can, or and anybody who's ever been a caretaker knows this is a very hard and just extremely testing time of the self. Caretakers are oftentimes the ones that might even go beyond just the treatment of our elders when they're mobile, but when they're no longer mobile, when they're no longer able to speak or do things. That's very, very hard on our folk, but it's always done with the idea of what's in best of care, or what's in best of mind, or what's the best ability. And that's changed throughout history. In migration period times, I think our elders, there's even reference to a scribe by the name of Procopius, who said that a lot of times during the migration period, our folk were moving around, and if people fell sick and were unable to get better, or if they were of an advanced age to the point where they could not maintain the movement of the people, as the all of the livestock and all of the men folk and women folk and children folk, sometimes there was the ending of life was done, and that's one of the things, like the evolution right now in Asatru. One of the big things is about don't be a kinslayer. And we know that was important even to our ancestors all the way back in those very, very harsh and dark times, because during those moments, not anyone of the blood, but someone of the tribe or the clan or of the people, they would do it, but not someone directly of the blood, because that was seen as such an egregious act. But yet at the same time, they're evolving during this time. We're talking about the Roman empire is out, and there's that life. The life of our ancestors was extremely harsh, but understanding that our elderly become ancestors, that's one of the things that I think our faith brings. When we lose someone, we know that they are not alone, that they go back to the plethora of many, the ones that came before us. It's a reunion in reality that we too will experience. And so we take a great solace and a great joy in the idea. We take sadness in the loss of them here, but we carry them on a name. We speak of them often. We talk about them. But where the rubber meets the road is that we understand that they go back to the great lines of those that came before us, those that experienced dreadfully harsh times. And still we are here. They brought us to this point. And so taking that solace into the ultimate attestment. I think a lot of other religions try to ply on that fear and that speculation. They try to use death as a caveat to project their ideology further. And I think there's nothing more cowardly, or even just absolutely misaligned and poisonous, venomous, if you will, where they try to take that away from us. You have to, you're the worth of your soul is entirely on you, and your ancestors may, not be there because they didn't follow some criteria or something of that nature. For us, no, we know that folk should strive to do good, and the biggest hope is that our ancestors will accept us when we do pass on and allow us back into that reunion. That's the greatest travesty, is to be separated from them, and they have the choice of doing that when they look upon your deeds through your life. But if you have tried very hard to live a noble life, the elderly become introspective and they start to teach. And I think that's something that our culture has always taken into absolute high stock. And it's even more tragic when you meet like an old man who's just embittered by life and is not willing to see himself in the grand scale of society, of his people. And that, his weird has woven him into a corner where he has to, spend that time kind of shaking his fist at things. We don't want to be that person, and we shouldn't strive to be that person. And if we find an elderly person who is not that they're willing to pass that information on, gravitate towards them, spend time with them, hold them and listen to them when you can. And I think that's been with our folk since immemorable time.
All right. Next question. What would be a good meal for Hexennacht? It kind of depends on where you're at and what sounds delicious to you. It all really depends. There's so many subjective things that can go into that, and I don't think that there's really a hyper traditional right or wrong way to that. Some people I know, to some of our holidays, or certainly some of our days for our heroes, they'll try to look back culturally to something that's, the origin of those things and get a meal from that cuisine. Hexennacht was kind of the attestations we have was it being a German celebration and a German day. So I think that, some German food would probably be awesome for that. I think that every occasion is a good occasion for schnitzel. Sauerbraten would be good. Rotkohl's awesome. I like clove flavor though, so a lot of people that don't necessarily. But yeah, I think a good German meal would be awesome for it. Other people, because of the time of the year, may want to go with something that's more of a springtime dish. But yeah, I think that's entirely up to you and what you and your family want to eat that you think's going to be tasty and thematic. I don't know if you're going to make get crafty and decorate up some stuff. Maybe you want to bust out some Halloween stuff. I don't know. It's up to you as far as what your theme wants to be. As long as it's significant and meaningful to you and your celebration of it, I think, go for it and cook whatever you like. What are your thoughts, Svan?
Ooh. Well, I was, I don't know, a lot of folks might not know this or not, but I think I mentioned it before. My culinary, I was in culinary school. I used to be a chef and things like that. So one of the things I would say is, if you were looking at the time of year, one of the big things that even the charms of Hexennacht that are utilized involve herbs that are fast growers, because right now the planted things are not in full growth. They usually, that first harvest hits right around midsummer. So a lot of things to incorporate right now would be wild or free, fast-growing herbs. And so that really depends on where you live and what you're able to grow or what you're able to get. Another thing to think about, like with Austria, Hasenpfeffer and rabbits and all of that have placement. But a good all-around year food that our ancestors definitely, understood was pork, was especially when they were trying to clear the pin of older animals. They had, right before mid winter, they were clearing the pork out to have smoked meats and things that would last through the winter, because that was a dangerous time and you needed to make sure you had long lasting food. But now we're heading towards midsummer. And so a lot of times the older swine that are in, in the pens, they might be big, and you've got maybe young, swinelets that need more room. So pork is always, I think, a good one to go to at any time of the year. And so, like, a perfect example, just throwing this out there, because fast cheeses, fast herbs, and pork, you could do a butterflied pork loin and put in like feta cheese or a type of fast, maybe dry cheese that survived the winter, and maybe do fresh like dandelion greens in there, and maybe some pine nuts, and then roll that bad boy up, wrap it in twine, and bake it. Make pinwheels. Serve that with like sauerkraut or some of the stuff that's survived the winter, if you will. If you're looking for thematic kind of attachment to the cycles of things, that would be a great meal.
That sounds tasty. Next question is for you, Svan. Svan, could you expound upon Frigg and her weaving?
Yes. Well, clearly, yes. The spinning wheel and the distaff are deeply connected to Frigg, and also to, now this is where, before we were talking about the mashing of divinities, but so I won't go towards that, but there seems clearly cultural significances that align the North Europe with Central Europe, and one of those big connections is Frau Holle. And the origin of that name is an interesting one, and I would recommend anybody to look that up. But she is also deeply connected to weaving, symbolizing with the flax and the distaff and the spinning wheel, and perched in the lowlands of Germany. So again, the evolutions of these names are interesting and important to look at. But one unifying factor is that the weaving. So in a folklore sense, especially amongst the Scandinavians, it's kind of known that you had to have new clothes by midwinter. The Icelanders even have this with the Yule cat, and the idea is that the kids would ask their parents, "Make sure you got clothes for me, or the Yule cat's going to get me," because he only eats children that don't have new clothes for the winter. And what that is a kind of a societal folklore story to that reflects back to an ancient practice in which all of the flax and all of the thread and everything that needed to be done from second harvest to midwinter needed to be done by then. And so that way there could be weaving that was done. So for new clothes and warmth and socks and mittens and hats and so on and so forth. So right out the gate, there's clearly those connections, and those connections are always related to motherhood. Because one of the biggest things that women had when they brought their dowry, and a lot of people think of a dowry as some sort of payment, but that was not what we, especially historically, have seen. No, the dowry was her property. The dowry was that which was given to her by her family to carry over to the new farmstead or homestead. And one of those big things was the loom, the distaff, and the spinning wheel. The ability for the woman to create thread and clothing for her family. Now, you can see in our lore, there's tons of connections to thread weaving. The Nornir, the witches, and they're the threads of fate of man, and the ability of the idea of twisting. We see this again in wending or witcha. The word witch in English means to twist or to twine. So clearly weaving in and of itself has a huge just feminine connection. But this one is unique because it's really focused in on as a product, something provided quite literally over your children, over your husband, over you were a source of like much needed life-saving equipment, if you will. Most people don't think of clothing that way anymore, but that is absolutely the truth. Um, even down to like linen socks, having linen socks so that your feet didn't get cold, you didn't get pneumonia, or you didn't, get a blister and that got infected and you could possibly die from that. So like very important stuff that our ancestors had to deal with. And so that connection there is about the prowess of the mother, and her power within the household is about kind of producing protective elements. And this is kind of extended to Frigg being a frith weaver, or one who connects forces together. It's referred to that she knows much but speaks very little, and that I think is kind of again a reference to like sometimes when you meet women who are knitters, I always find them fascinating when they're in the corner just knitting and they're listening, but they're just going about, they're gathering this information, they're hearing things, they're kind of it's like one of those things where you become like the fly on the wall, if you will, and they know much, they hear much, they know much, they see much. I think that's a reference to that as well, that the central point in which all factors kind of relate. And so I've always taken Frigg and her distaff, that's kind of like the feminine center, the much akin to the axis mundi, and this is something that's played over and over and over again in our stories and in our faith, is that there's always this kind of central vertical. And in this point, she's taking the raw and the barely processed and turning it into that next level of something that is, quite literally tying and weaving everything together. There's references, I can't like just pull them out. I don't have them on my notes like a link or specific quotes, but general references to women singing songs or speaking spells while they weave. And this I can attest to with like my grandmother used to sing while she knitted, and making Icelandic sweaters and stuff. And a lot of times too, it's kind of funny because the elderly folk would like seeing like a grandpa watching television, like watching sports, and he's got his hands up and he's holding the thread in between his hands, and he's just watching, and occasionally grabbing his drink and drinking it, and he's holding it while she's pulling this thread, and she's knitting sweaters for her grandchildren. That is a very common sight in the olden ways of things, and I know my grandparents did it. So but yeah, there's a lot of connection in that, just in the feminine in and of itself. And so when we talk about weaving, one of the big things, again, like with the Nornir and with other feminine powers within our divinities, the thread binding and weaving is integral to their one of the biggest things that women and the feminine do within our culture is weave people together. I think that a lot of hyper individualism in this day and age has caused both men and women to have that, not as so much of a societal thing, but a long time ago, it was very, very common to get things done on grand scale often involved huge amounts of teamwork. But that thread, that spinning, the concept of the Disir. The Disir is a title, and it's a feminine power, but you have to understand that even the goddesses were referred to as Disir. Like there's the Vana Dis, which is Freya, Ausa Dis, or Odin's Dis, which is Frigg. That they are in essence kind of weavers around them. They bestow upon them this power that they have placed their hands, their deeds, their mind, their will into. And so there's a huge connection there as well. And so I think one great devotional act towards Frigg would be getting into learning those arts, whether it's modern seamstress, the ability to create clothing. And again, clothing and fashion and so much has been, even in the modern age, especially Western dress and things of that nature, is slowly bleeding out of our people. And it's a shame. And so a lot of us are, trying to acknowledge that, bring homage to it and bring it back. But even if it's down to, knitting blankets. All of the women folk in the AFA, when a mother has a new baby, there's a blanket coming, and that was knitted by someone in the folk in the AFA. And that is that power, that kind of testament to the love, affection, and protection that Frigg provides.
All right. What do you think a mom can take away from the story of Frigga trying to protect her son from his fate and falling short? One thing that I love about our lore is that our stories are layered, and there's lots of dimensionality to the truths that they tell. And they reveal different things to different people at different times. And all of those things can be true simultaneously. One thing that I think is profoundly important is the depth of Frigg's love for her son, that she would literally go to the ends of the earth, to every living thing, to secure a promise that they would not harm her child, and to go, try to get every living thing to shed a tear. Caring that much and that deeply for your son it's a beautiful and it's a special testament. I think there's also lessons about some things in fate are unavoidable. One of the problematic things about Freya's wisdom, or Frigga's wisdom rather, is she sees all of these things. She knows things that are to come. And sometimes when you have that and then there's not the possibility of doing anything to fix it, there's a stress there. But I think that the beauty of the story and the takeaway is that here was a mother that loved her son so much that she was willing to go to the most extreme possible lengths to try to keep him safe and to show her love for him. And I think that's really special. What do you see in that story that a mom can take away, Svan?
Well, I think it's an overarching theme in every aspect about our testing of will in the world. We see it with the gods facing Ragnarok. We see it with Frigg and doing absolute and all her will to save Balder. So we see it like in Egil Skallagrimsson's saga, when a devoted warrior of Odin doesn't get chosen, doesn't get plucked up by the Lord, the choosing father, and he has to contend with a lot of that loss around the fire. And some of his later poems are written about that sadness and lament. So I think it is very much a common theme in the stories, but it's a 100% understandable theme within our lives. The question is, did you do enough? I think a lot of people cope with survival guilt in a lot of things. So the answer to that is a very hard one, in the sense, did you do enough? Because most people would say no, or they'll plot something to devastate themselves and saying, I could have done this, or I should have done that, and so on and so forth. But with the moment you have and the power you have, whatever it may be, to do the absolute most is all you can do. And oftentimes, again, the weaving of weird in our lives doesn't always garner peaceful or happy outcomes. So I think the overall testament there is about the oftentimes those that give the most love, especially a mother, obviously a mother, the physical attachment, the thread between the mother and the child being severed at birth through the umbilical cord. There's a lot of analogous to parenthood, and especially the loss that any any father or mother can attest to is that you try your absolute most to give the best, to do the best, to be there. And it, sometimes we fall short, sometimes we just get it right, and you celebrate the victories and you try to adjust for the failure. But ultimately, doing everything that you have within your power to do is what what you should do, or what a father should do in those times. It's just, I think it's a great understanding of that. Even despite all, the way things roll out do not always roll out for the benefit that perhaps we even understand. We see it as a great loss, but in some ways it can be a great victory. It kind of reminds me of the story of the farmer who, his son falls off the horse and breaks his leg, and everyone says you should be sad, and he says maybe, and then it ends up stopping him from getting conscripted into an army, and at the end of the story, the farmer just says maybe it's good, maybe it's bad. I think there's an understanding to that, but more so the power that you have, expending that power, and I think societally our in our culture, Germanic women, Teutonic women, or just Aryan women in general have always been highly noted for fierceness towards protection of their children, fierceness towards protection of their loved ones. So I think this is also a grand reflection of that as well. Culturally, it was understood what she was doing. And that was the sadness of the ultimate doom of it. But does it lead to better things, perhaps outside of the scope of understanding? That's the big thing about the gods. When we hear the stories and we hear the stories and like, why didn't Odin know? He knows all. Why didn't Frigga know? She knows all. The point isn't for Frigga or for Odin. It's for you. It's for the folk to learn that perennial truth.
A couple of other elements to that. First, I think that one lesson that our lore teaches us is there's honor in the struggle, whether the outcome leads to the victory you want. There's a value in doing the right things, whether it all works out or it doesn't, because you can say that you did your best, and that means something. It's kind of something that I do, and Svan knows this, and other AFA leaders I talk to about sometimes. But there's so many different things that factor in to the AFA's successes or failures in whatever we're trying to do. A lot of those things are determined by the blessings of our gods and by things that are out of my hands. But what I don't ever want to have happen is me not do enough, me not try hard enough. This comes, and I mean this with everything in the AFA, but very specifically, this comes into play when we're, really trying to get a Hoff, and we'll get really close and the deal will fall through, or, things will seem perfect, then we'll have an inspection and there's mold and we just can't do it. And whatever that case is, I want to make sure that I am absolutely obsessed with getting it right and leaving it all on the field, trying my best. I don't want the thing that's the difference between our gods receiving their Hoff or not be me being lazy or something foolish that I did or didn't do. And if you can do that, there's a tremendous amount of peace of mind, not in just saying that you did your best, but in knowing that you absolutely did all that you can do. And so you don't have regrets if things don't work out the way you'd like it to, because you have the peace of knowing you did everything you could. And I think that's a lesson of that story. And another thing that I think is kind of a side note to the story. Baldur's death was tremendously tragic, but one thing that happened was it spared him the conflict of Ragnarok and the destruction that occurred then. And at the fulfillment of Ragnarok, Balder comes back and inherits, and he returns to Asgard. And that's, I think, a part in that story that is important. All right, to change it up a little bit, Lou's got a question. Hi, driving home from work. This brings up a question I had. Obviously, we don't hail Loki in our hofs or group rituals at all. Are people who do so privately still welcome in the AFA? No. Loyalty is everything. We don't make friends with the enemies of our friends. We define ourselves by our troth to the Aesir and our loyalty to them. I am not a friend of Frigg while secretly at my house celebrating the murderer of her son. And I won't stand with others that are. Yeah, that's a hard line. And a follow-up also from Lou. Also, where's the best place to bloat to Frigg? In the home or out in the home, outdoors, wherever you want. I think that, again, so much is about intentions. If there's a place outdoors that's particularly special that you think is a beautiful spot to honor Frigg at, by all means do that. As you mentioned, it's also special to do ritual and things in your home to honor Frigg. We know that the home is an area that's sacred to her, and surrounded by your family, you know, with your children, with the mother of your children, perhaps with your own mother. And that's also a beautiful time and occasion to honor Frigg. There's very few bad places and bad occasions to honor our gods if your heart is pure and your intentions are right. What are your thoughts, Svan?
I've always found congruence for myself to be, by the fire, or in particular, I had a handmade Gothstead or Godstead, an image of Frigg above my stove, as a symbol of this is the heart of the home where the food is produced and much of the strength of the family comes from. And again, being a cook, that was me and my wife both cook, but we're both there in the kitchen doing things, so it became a unifying factor. So yes, I also saw someone say near a marsh. That's in reference, I think, for a lot of people who might not understand, is that there is a lot of connection to Frigga and the maidens of Fensaler being in the pervading area of mist between the earth and the sky. And that takes form in the fen, and the positive version of the fen versus the negative, like for Fenris, the dweller in the swamps. This is kind of seen as the marsh. But it's wherever you find those connective tissues, if you will, for your faith, and to where you feel comfortable. You could even set up a harrow inside your, child's bedroom, especially if they're a baby. And that might be a great place to honor Frigg and the maidens. Or just on the harrow along with all the other godsteads that are dedicated to the gods. But yeah, it's more about where you find connective tissue.
All right. Have either of you read the book Odin's Wife by William Reeves? It is a recent work. I have not. I have seen it. I've seen people with it. I can picture the cover in my mind right now, but no, I have not read it. What about you, Svan?
I don't own a copy. I've read excerpts and pieces and things of that nature. There's a couple of things with the sourcing of this that do bring to mind. Again, some things that we've already established are kind of not in the moral structure that we have been following within our faith is that, again, hypostasis. One of the big things about the book is the establishment that Jord is Frigg. And then that would imply perhaps that the mystery around Norun or Nerthus in Tacitus Germania and all of this. One of the big motivations behind this point is, I think, again, a hypostasising of the feminine to create an earth mother that establishes a sky father. And I think one of the modern problems that a lot of people are doing right now is they are, again, mashing the gods into a singular masculine and singular feminine, when we can see very early on in the expansion of our people, the Aryan people saw these establishments of hierarchy not as hypostasis, not as, oh, well, one god is just really this god or that god, and it just kind of like origami folds into one god, an over-pervading lord and an over-pervading lady. And we can clearly see that with Frigg and Freya. So again, if we start going down that path, what you end up getting is a lot of matching. At what point do you stop? And so there's clear indication. From what I've read too, it kind of points out some of the inconsistencies of Snorri. Snorri Sturluson did have a lot of inconsistencies. He had things with mimicking Greek euhemerism and like Greek, which was the pinnacle of literature at the time. That kind of motif, he was clearly going for it. There's some Christian stuff as well, especially in his painting of the afterlife and the world of the undead. Or I mean, of the dead and the undead, I guess. When you're dealing with spirits and evil things, and some of like the Yingatal and stuff. So that kind of attack on Snorri, I think, is warranted and is a positive sense of understanding that Snorri was influenced by other things and certainly wasn't just built around his faith. But it goes to state that he is closer to our ancestors and their understanding of the gods than we are. So that's at least a point in a direction that we don't readily have. And so the kind of I guess the overall argument to be made, if Jord is Frigga or Frigg, and we're talking about, again, when she's born of Fjorgen, and the references of these things. There's clearly some other times in which like people take that, like the maiden of Fensaler, Hlin, is mentioned as when Odin dies, is the despair of Hlin. So now, was that a text, or a poetic force? Was it a text like mistake, or was it a poetic kind of jamming in because of meter? Perhaps there's a story or a relationship, because we know that Odin has relationship with Sauga and so on and so forth. So maybe there's context that we're missing. But when we go down that road, we end up doing a lot of things that I think people have already established that they're against. For instance, the thoughts of like seeing the goddesses, the Ausenir, especially when we talk about the earth. We see Frigga or Frigg, we see Gerd, we see Gridr, we see Rindr, we see all of these Ausenir that are clearly showing variant structures and facetings of the earth. And that the earth, like the sun and the moon, were not seen as in the entity itself, but yet more a primordial warden of it. Like the spark of Muspelheim is the sun, and thus the warden of it is Suna, or Mauni is the warden of the primordial piece that is from the beginning, that is the moon. And so to the earth, again, most people can see the connection between the earth and the flesh of Ymir, so that the gods become they hold thrones or dominion over primordial forces because they order things. They order things and create them into channels that flow within the material and within the spiritual. But to say that they are all the same, despite their many dominions, is a dangerous path to go down. And so I've had big contentions with Snorri's labeling of divine powers as being Jotuns. Clearly, if I've often brought up if a Jotun, which the gods are descended from, and a lot of people try to think them as like different races, but yet Mimir, Odin's uncle, is a Jotun, or it's about that loyalty of those powers and ordering. Once they join the ordering, they become Aus. They become not primordial ancients, but orderly cosmic adjudicators, or they hold domain over cosmic order. And we see this in Jord and with Grímur. So that's a perfect example right there. When we see Jord, we see the giving earth. We see the mother of Thor. But then we oftentimes fail to see or hear about the story of Gríður, the Jotuness of the earth that helps Thor as well. And so you're left with, okay, well, maybe Jord and Gríður are the same. And then we start mashing stuff together to fit into a narrative. And again, it's the same with the Sky Father. I think ultimately the misguided sense of it is, I'm not saying there isn't a Sky Father, but what I'm saying is that there is a hierarchy or a faceting of the rules of the sky, and there's just as much a faceting in an individual domains of the earth. And our ancestors did that. Our Aryan ancestors were polytheistic. They weren't like bitheistic. And so if we do that, we kind of end up going down the path very much like what Wicca has done, where there's a lord and a lady, and ultimately the stories boil down to them just being the masculine and the feminine force. And I think that structuring and understanding divinity and the polytheism of polytheistic religions is starting to get kind of wishy-washy in works like that. And again, that's because some of the scope of it, it comes down to an understanding. So it's very easy to just say, oh, they're all Frigga, and Frigga is the Earth Mother, and she's married to Odin, who is the Sky Father, and that's it. That's easy. But we see again, Aryan mythos always works in the tripartite, especially involving the sky. There's always the stasis throne, the dynamic throne, and the catalytic throne. And there's always different gods in those thrones. So you have a dilemma, and that dilemma is very simple. Are all those gods the same god, just in different name? And are we then cramming all of our gods into one kind of just god form? Or are they individual willful divinity powers that have their own movement in weird? And I think polytheism is the belief that all things, whether from creation to destruction, always work in multiplicity. And so that's the one problem I have with some of the stuff I've been reading is, again, and we've established this in our calls. We've established this as a church. This is the way we go. It is better to individually honor as opposed to mash things together. And I think that people are desperately trying to make things easier, and in doing so, they're attacking like the lore in a way that crams the circle into the square, or crams the square into the circle. And if we go by what we have in lore, Frigg is mentioned as being born of the earth, just as much as Thor is born of the earth. We see again the primordial power, and then the dominion or the throne that is the threshold in which that power flows. I think that's a big difference that we should focus on, is looking at the gods as their ability to, one, move throughout creation and the levels of the world with dominion and power, but that they also become a threshold of a coursing part of power that is part of a whole, whether it's the primordial power of the earth or material, or they are, in essence, conduits of and thrones of dominion, and behind them projects the power that makes them, that they contain, which is cosmic order. So I want to be careful about mashing the gods into like all into one title, one name, because it becomes very dissipative when people try to force like, oh, Thor is, he's the thunder god, he's minor sky versus greater sky, and or Dellinger and Mundalfari, and they're all just really, names for Odin. Or that's, I don't think the way our ancestors and polytheism works.
So, and this is, well beyond the scope of the question, but and I say this a lot in these in these discussions, but I think it can't be restated enough. Our faith is not a science project. It is building a relationship with living entities that exist. So the damage of, let's just make it easy and pretend they're just all one thing, that's good enough, isn't it? Well, no, that leaves people out. That leaves spiritual personages that are worthy and deserving of our worship out from receiving it, because it's more convenient for us to treat it like a science project and assume two things are the same when we don't have reason to. It's impious. As people who want to express our piety and are moved and motivated by piety, the last thing we would want to do is be disrespectful to our gods. So we would err on the side of caution, because if you honor a god by two different names, that god is still receiving your praise and your honor. But if you assume they're the same one and you only honor one and not the other, then one of those gods who is worthy of worship does not get worshiped. And that's an extreme disrespect, and it's unacceptable. So as a church that believes in our gods, we want to err on the side of being the most pious and the most respectful, as opposed to run the risk of causing offense by guessing poorly on things like that. Our ultimate goal isn't to make the lore more understandable and easier for us to digest. Our goal is to worship our gods as best as we can in the most pious and authentic way we can. And those goals are very often at odds.
I did want to point out too that some people might say, oh, well, you guys are discounting, say, like etymology or something like that. We greatly try to place about with that in mind for lore. I mean, if we look at Nerthus and her etymological name being derivative of like the word earth, and Ersa or Hearth or Hertha, and we see this kind of growth of the name sourcing from Nerthus, from Tacitus's Germania. And then we see Jorð being the Nordic word for the earth. And we see that etymological connection, but there is a big step there immediately between Jorð and the precious one, Frigg, which the closest that we can gain, especially with all of the iterations of Frigg's name, whether it's Fricko or Frijo or Freya or Free, which causes even more infinite confusion with Freya. That's a pretty big etymological jump. The other thing is not too far after, Snorri aside and the sagas aside and the prose Eddas, is that we do know that continental Germanic folk honored like Fricko, and I'm referring to the Lombardic story in which she's clearly and cleanly mentioned. And that's during the migration period, which is even far closer to Tacitus's time. And that referencing, that correlation there's no connective tissue. She's seen very much as the individual goddess that we call Frigg. So I would argue that unless there's like perhaps maybe some more etymological evidence that bridges that big gap. And again, people do that. They will bridge that gap in any way they see it. And sometimes that can cause a lot of problems. But ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not a science project. It's something that we work towards. But when we honor them like correctively as we know them, in order to, again, if on the back end, secretly somebody says, Svan doesn't know what he's talking about because Frigg and Jorð are clearly the same. Well, I honor Jorð and I honor Frigg. I am not any at the loss of reverence. But if you choose to mash them together and put their names together and say their name is Fjord, at that point, you're doing disservice to divinity. And that is where that causes more complications. There's a lot of complications on that mashing road, if you will.
That's the thing with the best of intentions. Sometimes there are divinities that are confused because they're coming from different sources and they're named different things when they're really a singular divinity. Of course that happens in the body of our literature at some point. But there's a far cry from picking those that we have solid foundation and solid reason to believe are the same and trying to mash lots of them together because it just makes it easier. At the end of the day, if these are just archetypes and this is all just kind of a symbolic, our rituals are a symbolic game that we play mentally to focus on different archetypes, then it doesn't matter. Why don't we just, make it as simple and as clean as we can? Because that would be really easy. But they're not. They are literal gods and literal goddesses. And therefore our building an actual personal relationship with them is the purpose of our religion and the practice of our religion. It's the purpose of being Asatru. And so we endeavor to do that with a mind towards individual personality as best as we can.
And I think too, something worth, like we see the gods as like vessels, and each vessel may contain the visceral power of order and the overall power of the divinity. But each vessel is its own, and in a way turns that when the fluid flows into that vessel, it leaves that vessel differently. And that's one of the things that I try to point out when we talk about dominions or thrones of power, is the liquid going in may be labeled as, like, say, cosmic order. But when it enters the vessel of, say, the goddess air, we're talking about healing. When it leaves the vessel of Thor, we're strength and might and protection and power. These vessels are very important to the that which binds them together. So to say that they're the same vessels is where the disrespect kind of level comes in. And the other thing that really kind of gets me is, and this is something recently developed that I've been thinking about, one of our Witan members brought up, and I just hit the ball right out of the park and got me thinking about stuff, is the concept of, like, say, Gulve, and perhaps we'll talk more about that with Freya, but Gulve, the gold thirst, being Freya, is a lot of the same mash path as yours being Frigg. And a lot of the people that really do condone a lot of Reeve's work will gladly soak up the path, that mash path of Jorð is Frigga, because they need her to be the Earth Mother, directly in correlation to Sky Father. But they will gnash their teeth at Gulve and Freya, that mash path. And I thought that was an interesting point. And I was like, wow, I never even thought of it that way. But again, we are consistently holding to our moral framework. And so that's something worth considering. I'm going to get the book. I'm going to read it, because knowledge is knowledge, and it's very, very good. But got to be able to kind of stick to your framework and piece through information. And again, learn from everything, but don't compromise oneself based off of, in just something kind of falling in your lap. It takes a lot of time and process to digest and organically change if there is evidence to prove otherwise or concentric.
All right. Our next question. Could the story of Baldur's death be a warning of the dangers of overprotecting one's children? If she hadn't made everything promise not to hurt him, he wouldn't have felt invulnerable, and no one would have thrown anything at him. Is this a good or a bad way to interpret the story? Like I said earlier, there's a lot of truths in each of these stories. They're meaty with truth. Yes, I think that there's something in there about when you try to escape fate, fate gets you in the end anyway. And, there's plenty of folklore about those things happening. If it wouldn't have happened that way, it would have happened a different way. I think there's a truth to that. But, like I said earlier, I think there's something to be said for, saying, I don't know, probability be damned. We're going to try our best regardless and be satisfied that we've done our best. What do you think, Svan?
Yeah, I think like the overall and arching wisdom of the tragedy. And again, this does place in Hellenic circles as well. A lot of Hellenic stories follow the same path, is that the path you take to avoid your fate often brings you to it. And this is, again, I think this is an interesting debate amongst the folk in relation to willful action and or fatalism, as it's often referred to on the other side, where, it doesn't matter what you do, your fate is your fate. And other, or is it a certain mixture of will and fate and things like that? I think that also was part of the real drive of the story. And so I think it's ultimately a warning about in the face of danger, we laugh oftentimes. I think culturally, for most people on this call will know like what I mean by we laugh in the face of danger, we meet our end smiling, and we go forth in glory, and that is culturally an aspect of our lives. This is kind of saying be careful about hubris versus thumos. And I'm using the Greek words because those are a little bit easier to kind of like allocate on the internet if you look up, and again, that's very Hellenic too. So there's an overarching concept of thumos is about bravery and about honor and about living a bright life. Hubris is when you take it too far and you fail wisdom. And so, courageousness tempered by wisdom is thumos, and courageousness without it is hubris in a lot of ways. So, I would say it would be a warning. I don't know if it's necessarily a warning to a mother, again, but the overall arching point of the story is that we must do all that we can because the option to do nothing was seen far worse. So do all that you can. But when the gods are throwing things at Baldur, that is definitely a painting of that kind of hubris moment that allows for the deceitfulness of Loki to sneak in, to find the blind and to guide his hand. And he searched for the gentle mistletoe, that frail and tiny and joyous piece, the child of the oak. And the one thing that wouldn't do any harm does the greatest harm. There's a lot of things we can see in like the Grimm fairy tales and even in like Slavic lore and Hellenic lore. There's a lot of those adages in there kind of woven in. It's a really beautiful story. It's great. But yeah, I think hubris is the warning overall. And it's not necessarily on Frigga's part, but on all of the gods and perhaps even of Baldur. But yeah, the way that Snorri again paints Baldur is kind of, I think he's influenced by Christianity, and you see this kind of like childlike innocence also involved with him as well. Whereas clearly his name denotes boldness, courage, and strength. But so I would say that perhaps even on his part, even if you remove the Christ-like imagery out of it, it was, everything is oathed, to not touch me. Let's see where this goes. Let's see how this plays out. And everyone's doing things, and everything's affirming that that it is correct. But that allows the avenue for the deceitful one to slip in and kill his brother's son, his blood brother's son, if you will.
All right. Do you all have a go-to book of scripture, sort of like a Bible? No, we don't. And I think that any comparison would be really, really loose. But I would say our closest thing to a go-to source for our lore would be the prose and poetic Eddas. They're where the majority of the stories of our gods come from in, the most detailed and meaningful ways. And I think that's the closest thing you'd get to, but it's not something that we believe is, the divine word of the gods. But it is the traditions of our folk and our faith, as was recorded in the 1200s. And it's the closest that we have. But it is the best go-to compilation of the stories of our gods that we have available. Next question is, I'm kind of confused. Hother, being blind, was tricked into killing Balder by Loki. Vali kills Hother, his kin, but he is not called Kinslayer. Why is this? Loki should be the one Vali kills, right? And I think there's layers to that. One of the reasons that I mentioned earlier about how strife amongst kinsmen was such a horrible curse, because there is no right answer. It's your job to avenge your kinsman. But if your kinsman's killed by another one of your kinsmen, what are you supposed to do? Either way is wrong. There's no right answer. And that's why it's an imperfect solution, because an impossible and a terrible situation was created. And I think this speaks to that. Vengeance needed to happen, especially for a god, a personage the stature of Balder. He needed to be avenged. And so Vali was born with that purpose in mind. Boom, quick, make vengeance happen. And, that occurred. What I will say is, you're right. A lot of it needed to be placed. The blame needed to be placed on Loki. Hother was killed as an implement of the murder, but Loki was the problem. And Vali is involved in the binding of Loki. And when the gods formed a posse to go get Loki, Vali was involved in binding Loki with Loki's son's entrails. So he was instrumental in delivering vengeance to Loki as well. But yeah, it's really unfortunate. And I think it points out the tragedy of when something like that happens between kin. Is there is no right answer. And the cycle of vengeance doesn't have an end. And you got to kind of figure out where to stop with it and what's the best of a terrible situation. And it's all bad at that point. That's why it was such a horrible curse to our ancestors. Do you have anything to add on that, Svan?
Yes, one thing worth noting, and you mentioned it, but to kind of go a little bit into it, one of the things is once you commit the atrocity, you become severed from the connection of it all. And that's why it's such a scary thing. When, for instance, when we look at the story, we look at Balder the bright, the light, the shining, the visible, the bold, The heart in juxtaposition to Hother, the blind, the dark, and the ignorant, if you will. He's ignorant of what's about to happen and so much and so forth. But what this is an adherence to correct law, an adherence to correct action, an adherence to correct way. And so Vauli represents, because he is birthed from, like, he's birthed at this moment in his entirety to correct that which is out of balance. And so Hother is in essence tragically separated from the whole, but is in a way, it's because he must be united with Balder. They are together in their correlation to each other. So when Balder dies, then so too must the correct action be that Hother dies, that they become back in the equalness of each other and what the powers that they are, the gods that they are, and what they represent. Is that correct action? And that correct action is wrought out by one of our gods, Vauli. And Vauli is the adjudicator of what I would call extreme and immediate dharma. He is the vengeful sword, the arrow that strikes through fate and immediately knocks everything down. And no god has been like him until he is made. Not even washed. He immediately enacts this corrective action. So he shows up and is unlike any other of the Aus, and he is a terrible sight to behold. The fury and the vengeance in which he enacts himself is swift and terrible. But everyone that's involved gets kind of like the correctiveness that they deserve. Even though Hother is ignorant, that's the tragedy. He removes himself by being a kinslayer, even though he was ignorant of it. Once you kill kin, you are no longer kin. And so a lot of times that, I think this reflects to an ancient way of thinking for our ancestors when there was tragedy, say perhaps on a farm way out in the middle of nowhere, and something happens between siblings or something like that, and there has to be a corrective action to it. Now, our ancestors had a lot of ways of doing that, and societally we could talk about that, like were guilds and so on and so forth. But overall, Vauli corrects the action, immediately reuniting Hother to Balder, the darkness to the light. He does it immediately, and Hother has removed himself from the kin. And then, uniquely enough, even though the onus is on Loki, what he does is he does it in a way that's equal to Odin. Odin has lost his son. So in binding him in punishment, the punishment is long standing with the venom and the snake and being, bound in the kettle groves. That's a long and terrible punishment. But to equate to him, that punishment, Vauli then kills Loki's son and binds him with him so that his punishment is unequivocally attached to the loss of his son. That is what makes Vauli so damnably scary, is because if he moves, if he enacts his ability is like, if he moves, something bad is going to happen. So and we're talking on a godly level, and it's going to happen so fast that it will leave everything changed from the moment he steps in and then steps out. He is that threshold. He is that fulcrum point that is absolutely terrifying. So that's, yeah.
All right. So completely shifting gears, with the women and men who will be living at Sigrheim, will there be families with kids, and will their education ultimately only be from the AFA school? Also, does the mandatory learning of duties come in? This is an add-on, such as duties for women and men, like motherhood and strength building to build our strongest people there. So first, absolutely, there's families there. The idea of having families with young kids there and those kids being able to grow up together is a huge part of why we want to do it. My family will move there. We've got a number of other families with young children that'll move there that are planning on it. It's a very big part of what we're planning to do. And then also a big part of that is to facilitate the homeschooling of those kids so that we can, one idea is to have like a frontier schoolhouse kind of situation there, where you have, a room full of students that might be all different ages, but you have one teacher there teaching them all curriculum, or a couple of different adults there teaching them curriculum, and freeing up other adults to be able to do the things they need to do if that needs to happen. But our kids being able to build friends amongst our folk and in the AFA, and build those relationships and grow up with other AFA kids is a huge part of why we're doing it. We're not going to mandate that parents have to do that if they want to enroll their kid in a different, in their own different homeschooling program that they're doing. The location makes it kind of impractical for certain amounts of public school, depending, or at least a good distance. But if parents want to do that for their kids, that's certainly their choice. But no, we're going to put a heavy emphasis on encouraging folks to participate in our Asatru Academy, which is doing really, really well, by the way. And absolutely, some of the things that are involved in that are teaching little girls how to be appropriate women of our folk, and to teach, boys how to become the men that we need for our folk, and to instill those values in them at an early age, and teach values and character throughout those programs. That's already being added into the curriculum. And it's a really important part of the education in the Asatru Academy. Just something to mention on that, our homeschooling program, the Asatru Academy, this year we're getting relatively close now to finishing up our first year of studies. That was just kindergartners, and they're doing fantastic. But by this next school year, by fall registration, we're going to have curriculum and everything available to enroll students from kindergarten through third grade at a minimum. And so that's a big leap. That's going to be great for a lot of kids. We're very, very excited about it. But no, absolutely, having our kids grow up in and around Sigrheim is a huge part of why we're doing it. It seems that the AFA isn't more exclusive than Israel's right to return, or Native Indian tribes' generic tests for membership. At what membership size do you imagine we will see fair treatment? I don't imagine that a membership size will determine our fair treatment unless that membership size is, 100%. I don't think there's a membership threshold that does that. I don't think our membership numbers affect us, but the distance between us and where those numbers would be big enough to make a difference is vast. I mean, we would need to have the equivalency of like Catholics, or all the Jews, or, a huge group of millions, tens of millions of Asatru practitioners in order for that to, I think, move that needle on us treated fairly. I don't think the issue right now preventing us from being treated fairly is one of numbers, outside of those kind of titanic numbers. I think the thing that's bothering us is the political climate that we live in. We support all of the things that woke is against, and that's the thing that's very difficult. The political current in the West is very, very toxic and askew from all things traditional, and we represent traditional values and traditional understanding, and I think that is the struggle that we face. And I know better than to expect fairness from the media, from randoms, and I don't think we're going to get fairness from the media. I do think, and I do expect fairness. Well, When I say expect, I'm prepared for this not to be the case, but I do hope for and feel entitled to respect from legal entities. And so far that's been upheld, and that's been the case. And we do get treated fairly by people who actually know us. That's something we've seen every place we have Hoffs, and where we actually exist as real people and not internet boogeymen or whatever the media paints us as. No, those people have treated us very fairly. And the white people in those communities, but overwhelmingly the minorities in those communities have treated us very fairly. And so I appreciate that. Have you considered annually recognizing the highest monetary and non-monetary contributors? Official recognition may engage the competitive spirit of our people into outdoing one another even more. I really like the idea of that. What I found to be the reality with especially our largest economic contributors is they're very humble people, and they don't want a lot of attention. The people that have donated the most to us have specifically asked that we don't mention them. So we try to respect that. I do always look for ways of honoring those people. We've got plaques at our Hoffs of people who've contributed significantly to those. I think finding ways to recognize and honor people that contribute to what we're doing, as you mentioned, monetarily and non-monetarily, is really important. It's easier, and we don't run into the same resistance on honoring folks who've contributed non-monetarily. And we try to do that as best we can and recognize those people when we get together. But something definitely to think about. I think, utilizing the competitive nature of our people to make ourselves better, to make our church better, to do more good things for stuff we all believe in is a net positive for everybody. And I know that comes into play at our auctions. Our auctions are a lot of fun, and we see a lot of competition at those. And the AFA always wins on how that competition goes. So that always works out really good.
Something to add to that just a little bit. As I think for a lot of people that might not know, we have, subscriptive support member, but we do have a lot of folk that also go into Hoftoller, and to contribute in that way is a huge benefit because of how it aids us and keeps us away from people that are constantly, trying to demonize us.
So I'm glad that you mentioned that, because folks may not be aware of it, or, it may be a new concept, or maybe people don't understand it. Hoftoller has been something we've done the past few years, and it's been a really, really big benefit to us. Ultimately, we want to move away from a set dollar figure monthly dues membership kind of thing. That's much more the model of a club or of an organization. What we have been moving towards, and where we want to get, is into a percentage-based giving situation that is the expectation and the culture of our church, like pretty much all functional religions around the world do. And call it different things. The word Hoftoller is an actual term that our ancestors used to use, and it was a toll or a tax that supported the Hofs and the Gothar. And so the idea, and we didn't want to go in and ask too much. We don't want to be money grubbing. We need money to keep the lights on. We need money to do the great things that we're trying so hard to do, but it's not about that. So we ask that, 1% be that minimum for Hoftoller. We've got a lot of people that do that now. There's ways you can do it on your own. There's ways that some folks can have their employer take it out of the paycheck. That way it is more tax advantageous. Again, any of your donations or membership to us is tax deductible, because we're, a 501c3 nonprofit church, at least in the United States. So yeah, so the Hoftoller is a big deal, and that minimum's 1%. There are people out there that give, I think about 10% is the most that I've heard, and there's people all the way in between there, and that makes a huge difference. One of the cool things about that is it's very fair, to use the word. Like if you're having a hard time, then if your total that comes in is less, then that percentage is a much smaller number. If you're doing awesome and the AFA is a part of that in some way, then we can share in that, and we can share in each other's success, and that's a really important thing for us too. But yeah, that's where we're trying to go. We would love to have all of our folk on Hoftoller, so we could stop hounding people about monthly dues, and we could have a culture of giving, so we don't do that. I'll tell you this, I have to push on our folk builders hard to do that. None of our folk builders, if they ever bother you about dues, that's the last thing they want to do. Nobody likes to do that. I hated that when I was a folk builder. It's awful. It's what we got to do, and I don't apologize for it. It's why we have 4 Hofs to our gods, and we're doing really well that way. But nobody likes to have to do that, and we'd love to move away from that, and that's what we're trying hard to do.
And something else.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say something else that people might not know. Clergy, I am on Hoftoller. I pay Hoftoller. So it's not something that's done, like pressed down or something like that. Is the Gothar, they give as well. I'm on 10%. So just to I guess, because competition, he said competition and recognition and all this, we don't shy away from that. That is part of our culture, is being able to boast and to brag. And I'm very proud to say, even despite the fact being Gothar, being Witan, I give Hoftoller because it's important. It gets, and then that on top of things that we need at the Hof, it's oftentimes I will just get it myself. To help and to do whatever. So that's something worth noting as well. I think it's important. All of our Gothar are involved even as well. It doesn't make them outside of it.
We've got some really, really generous folks, and I want to thank all of you guys who've donated and been generous. I think this is as good a time as any to bring up kind of where we're at with Njordshof. So we have Njordshof, but in order to do that, we had to take out two personal loans for that. One individual is an AFA member. The other individual is, in our larger circles that is supportive of things that we do. And so anyways, we took out those 2 loans, and it was the biggest dollar value of Hof that we've purchased so far. And so, so we did that. And in order to pay it off, because that's the first step for us getting Frey's Hof, is to pay off all the loans for Njordshof, then we can start moving towards that. So this last month, I was very happy to say we were able to pay off one of the 2 loans that we had. So of those 2, one of those is completely paid off. That person made whole. We're on the other side of it, and we have one more loan left on that Hof. Overall cost of that Hof was $245,000. And then we now have that whittled down to just over $112,000. So we're getting there. These are big numbers, but they're getting chipped away. If you'll remember, we bought that Hof in July. So in a very short amount of time, we've been able to pay off the first loan and make good progress on the second. And that's because you guys are generous, and we really appreciate it. Thank you. This is so trippy that we are talking about Frigg. I recently did a video on Alphany, a matron goddess known from votive stones. Will you do an episode on goddesses that we know about from votive stones? Svan, do you have any insight into this?
Yeah, we've definitely been talking about where to go from here because, we've been talking about the 12 holy Aus, and now we're moving into some of the Ausenir, and there is a great plethora of Ausenir and a various level of dedication, or whether they're local or venerated in certain parts of Europe and things like that. So we've been really discussing about where we were going from here. One of the things, like tonight, I didn't know if we were gonna, we always discuss divinity, and then we kind of move into questions, and that can be a wild ride because we have no idea what's coming, and we don't prep for this, so we just shoot from the hip. But I mean, discussing like the maidens of Fensaler and the goddesses surrounding Frigg. I didn't know if we were going to broach that threshold tonight, or if that's perhaps something for future. I mean, clearly the first thing about our structure of the Ausenir, or the goddesses, is really based around Frigg and Freya, and then we move out from there with the maidens of Fensaler, and also to the divine powers that are aligned with the gods outside of that. And there's a lot of discussion as to where all of that fits, because when it comes to the goddesses in our faith, it's the Aus are very upright and pillared and easy to focus on. It's the interweaving of the Ausenir that becomes very not complicated, but intricate, if you will. And so utilizing discussions further, I don't know, whether it's like Alphany or Nehelania, or some of the or Frau Hola or Perchta, which I had mentioned earlier. I don't know where we're going with that, and I do know that we don't. I know members of the AFA, some of them would hold votive like prayers to specific goddesses that are correlated through maybe their ancestry. If they're German ancestry, they'll hold faith to Perchta. If they're lowland Germans, if they're highland Germans or Swiss, they mention Frau Hola and they hold ceremony to that. Or even with some of the Anglo-Saxon, I don't think that when it gets into that field, we don't get super. It's better to be devotional and to have that faith, so we don't get super laser pointed on that. So I don't know where we're going to go with that. That's a great question.
It's one of the things with our goddesses, and that's always been kind of an Indo-European thing, is our gods are written in these big bold letters, and they're very solid, and they move with our people, and they're omnipresent, whereas so many of our goddesses are much smaller in scale, are much more localized, are related to natural things that exist in one place on Midgard, goddesses of rivers and lakes, or groves and special places like that. So, we've got Frigg and Freya that are the great goddesses of our folk. And then we have several that are much smaller, and figuring out votive worship of those and how best to do that is kind of an interesting challenge that we, embrace now, trying to figure out. But there's certainly a level of might difference there seems to be between goddesses like Frigg and Freya and some of these smaller, more localized goddesses. And so acknowledging that too goes into what our plans are. We're currently discussing what our next Matt and Svan topics are going to be. Alternating on these other weeks here, we have episodes on our heroes. They're really important. Our heroes absolutely need to be talked about and celebrated. We are 2 episodes into our hero episodes, and there has been not one question asked about any of these heroes we've done episodes on during the episode. But that's okay. We're going to keep doing them anyway, because it's really important, and these people deserve to be talked about and their stories being told.
One thought I had too is there's no shortages of discussion about holy tides again, that was brought up about Sigrblot and Ostra and Hexenacht and Midsummer. So making some of that clarified. And then, of course, just the conversations that come out of that seem to be really good. So I don't know.
That's the thing. Any of these thematic shows, today we've talked a lot about Frigg, actually. But a lot of these thematic shows will have, maybe half an hour, 45 minutes of topical discussion about the theme, and then the rest of the show is just kind of taking it wherever the current leads, depending on y'all's questions. And that's very organic. I like the way it works that way. And you guys have really good questions, and it seems to be working out pretty well that way. Next question. Has anyone heard about goddesses like Freya Gabis or Nehelania? Yes.
You just mentioned Nehelania.
Yes, Svan just mentioned her. And Freya Gabi, I actually, when I was studying to be a Gothi, I had to do a little bit of research on more obscure gods and goddesses. And that was one that I did, was looking into what I could learn about Freya Gabi. I don't think they're well known though. Next question, also from the same person. Question: I did Indo-European deity study, and there is a goddess of the tripartite society, warlike, priest, and fertility aspects of all within her. Would Frigg be our reflex of that goddess? What do you think, Svan?
Well, again, that's one of the things where we talk about the war aspect in correlation to Freya, and then the queenly aspect and the Frith Weaver and establisher of sovereign femininity and correlation to oath boundness between marriage and children and training and teaching the next generation and all of that. The reflex of that is a little hard. Because again, we kind of hit that before, and I think that was from Ryan, and I think he just came in. But earlier on in the show, we were discussing about the internalized being projected feminine and the externalized being receptive feminine in regards to Freya and Frigg. And so the warlike aspect, again, when there's correlation to, say, Freya and the Valkyrie, or the Valkyries, as they're often, we know in English. So there's a lot of warlike connectivity, and I was in that same discussion, and that same Witan member placed some good stuff on that discussion that night, and he was talking about how Freya does, first and foremost, kind of epitomize an elder and more Bronze Age or older. I'm putting Bronze Age just out there, but imagine it, if you will, like an Iron Age versus a Bronze Age. The requirements of the women folk may have been more harsh, more brutal, more determinate, as opposed to, say, maybe later on in the Iron Age. Tacitus referring to the Germanic women standing on the edges of the battlefields, while their menfolk were fighting and things like that, versus perhaps, women folk holding down the home while the menfolk were away in the Nordic Iron Age. There's a difference there. And again, when we look at the time scale of the gods from our stories, we see this time where after the slaying of Ymir and the deluge, and the sources of primordial resistance that come from Bergelmer are coming from the east into the middle world. In the west, there is the world of the Vana, the place of life. And so Earth is seen in its encapsulation as going on. It's happening, and it's moving. And then 3 Aus come down and shape something new, and then leave. And the progression of humanity, of the folk, happen in this state. And so a lot of times you'll hear the term like the Vana are the old gods, and that's really because humanity, is shaped and the interactions that they have with the divine in the middle, the gods attached to natural law, are the first ones we truly interacted with, even though we are sourced from cosmic order and they came down, but there was time there. So Freya is of the older gods in the sense that after we were shaped and given on, and the primordial resistance sees the slayers of their source, that's the slayers of Ymir, have once again trifled on the Middle Earth. By that time, there was already established powers. There were the Dvergar or the Svartalvar, and the Ljosalvar were already in process. And in the east, there was the primordial resistance, the Jotuns. And in the west, there were the Van, the waning ones, the ones connected to the material. And those were the first gods we really encountered, while the Aus were above and kind of not quite in full incorporation yet, until, of course, after their war, because the witnessing of the war between the gods is a huge point of our faith. And after seeing that war and their alignment, that's when they come down again unified, because now Heimdall or Rig comes down to intercede into the folk and teach us and make us better. It's after that union. So I think that it's worth noting that Freya is the elder concept of, I think, femininity when we talk about a lot of that, that savageness, that reflex. When we see Frigg, it's of an expanded time in which both Frigg is seen as a maiden of the earth. She's born of Fjorgen, and she is that maiden, and that maiden comes about after the union, or she at least joins the Aus and becomes the bride of Lord Odin after their union. And so she is coming after a time of strife, when there is stability, when cosmic order and natural law are in their correct pace. So the reflex of war and things, I think, is kind of like seeing the war goddess, seeing the violence part of connected to femininity, is either one in association with elder times when things were rough, or when things are rough. That's a sign of that kind of displacement. When the war and the struggle bleeds over into the feminine, we've got dire situations when we're circling the wagons and even the women folk are grabbing guns. That's not a good time. So the warness and all of that, it really does fall upon the mantled shoulders of the men folk. And Frigga represents that. She is the goddess of femininity in a stable and well society in which things are working organically. Natural law and cosmic order are moving like a well-oiled machine.
So, as far as theorized older Indo-European goddesses go, what I think is really significant in this book that I like, called Deep Ancestors. I like to call it the Wheel and the Donkey because on the cover it's got a wheel and a donkey. But I enjoy it. The guy's a lefty, but if you take his little intro out of it and you read the information, it's really good. But what he talks about in there that I think is perfectly personified in the difference between Frigg and Freya is the idea of the cow goddess versus the mare goddess, about a goddess associated with the home, with women in a structured society, in a position as wife and mother and wise woman of the tribe, versus the wild, passionate, the lover, the unbridled feminine youth, and that passion and magical nature and mystery that involves. And those are two very different sides to femininity that each of these goddesses represents in a very special way. And that's where I think the overlap between primal Indo-European divinity is. I think that's where how that's come to us in its most direct form. Ali asks, is there something we as the AFA could be doing better or start doing to honor not only our own mothers, but the elderly women who have become mothers of the folk? Yes, first, the answer to that question will always be yes. There's always more we could do or better than that we could do on that. I'm not sure what exactly some of those ideas are. I know people have talked about maybe honoring women who have lots of children in the AFA. I think we try to do a very good job of getting mothers in the AFA to be celebrated and honored. I think that happens a lot naturally in our AFA groups and things. But one thing, and this is not female specific, but dealing with elderly women who've become mothers of the folk, I think this goes with all of our elders. And I think it probably disproportionately is relevant to women because they do tend to live longer than men do. One thing that we want so badly to do at Sigrheim, and I think this is kind of outside the scope of your question, but I think it's a good time to bring it up, is to, when we're getting, this is probably phase 2 or 3, but when we're getting housing and lodging there for apartments or cottages or small, places for elderly people to live, if they find themselves to where they need to live around others because they need help with things, or because they financially have found themselves elderly and not doing well financially, or, if they just want to, we'd love to have them there with us. But that's certainly a way that I look forward to us taking care of our elderly in the relatively near future, and being able to, if we've got little cottages or dorms or bunkhouses or whatever we've got, to where there's a place where elderly people can live, they can have heat, they can, it can be warm, they can be safe, they can be around people who love them and care about them, they can be connected there to their faith. And, I can't promise them deliciousness, but if they, get to the main hall there, they can have beans and rice all day long if they want. So they can be, they won't have to worry about being hungry or cold or alone or isolated from their religious practice or their community. And that is a dream we can absolutely make true. And we're going to do that. Hopefully we'll be able to do that sooner than later. It's one of those things that, it takes money to do it, but that's something that we're very much committed to doing. Svan, do you know of any ways off the top of your head we could do better to honor mothers or the elderly mothers who are the mothers of our folk?
I would say maybe looking at local community centers, both in the elderly sense. There are a lot of community centers that gather and hold events, or perhaps, I think they even hold classes that are available to people to come in. If these women know how to do things and they want to teach younger women, that's kind of open there. I think also looking at recreational centers, like community recreational centers, might be a good place to start, looking at where a lot of the older folks come in and they have a hobby, and that hobby is actually something from, decades past that was very, very popular. And that's a great way to kind of get involved, whether it's in knitting and sewing or just getting out there and giving company. Find the climate of the situation. You might be able to bring your kids, and a lot of, some at certain folk homes and at recreational centers, children are seen as a boon, where they want to see kids, and maybe they don't get visitations a lot from immediate family, or circumstances might have happen, or what have you. Search it out.
That's a thing. My mom for the last 3 years has been living, or she was living at an old folks home. And when I'd bring Aubrey in there, man, those old ladies would just light up. Everybody in there would light up, the staff, the old men or whatever, but the old ladies especially would just light up seeing a young child in there and getting excited about her. So that's always a nice thing to do. Next question. Orion's belt is/was called Freya's distaff, symbol of authority in the home. right? Svan, do you know much about Germanic?
Astronomy or astrological?
Well, I suppose, but that has more of an esoteric meaning to it. But yeah, do you know anything about how Germanic ancestors perceived astronomy and astrology that way?
So one thing that's really hard about that is we know that our ancestors, especially the Nordic seafaring, all the way back to the migration period, have understood stars, have understood how to use them for navigation. But what's really sad is the what is left of that is so scant that it's dreadful. I mean, immediately the three things that come to my mind is, of course, Frigg's distaff and Orion, which again I've looked into, and I honestly don't know if where that's sourced in elder literature, because I know, like, correlatively Orion and Hercules and the association with Thor and the Aryan I guess titling of the belted warrior bearing a club is the striker motif. Again, sometimes it's taken in a mortal form, and sometimes obviously it's divine based. The striker is divine, but he seems to also, some cultures have kind of over time lost connection to him and relegated him into a mortal sense. So I've often been looking at the Orion, Hercules, and Thor connectivity on the like in patterns of the stars. But when we talk about patterns of the stars, we're talking about, the first the Babylonians, and then eventually the Greeks and their additions and things. But we do know the major two is Arundel's toe and Thiazi's eyes are directly correlated to stars. The problem is we don't know which one. And the only thing that we have is Arundel is associated with the East. And so perhaps we don't know, but it might be referring to Sirius, the dog star. But that's not 100%. And that is one thing that's terrible. And the only person that I've ever read and studied on that has ever kind of covered the topic, both the esoteric astrology and the scientific astronomy, is a runic author and thinker, is Nigel Pennick, who has a book dedicated to that. I think it's runes and the I honestly can't recall. It's a very old book. I have it upstairs. It has the 24 hours and 12-hour dial with runes around it, each one representing the 24 runes representing each of the 24 hours. And he goes into about the astrological significance of both the runes and stories of the gods, and how our seafaring ancestors would have had a lot more, but it's unfortunately a lot of it hasn't survived, and most of it in folklore and in sailor folklore in like the Nordic countries has fallen to the wayside for Christian lore, or even just secular names for the stars. So it's really kind of unfortunate, because it's pretty much like we very much know, we know that our ancestors were very, very heavily influenced with music, string instruments and wind instruments, but they're so scant because of poetic Eddas that you would think, nothing's ever mentioned of a drum, but we know the drum is the most ancient instrument, or the animals, there's lots of animals mentioned, but there's never a mention of an owl, which I always thought was so strange, being that, the boreal owl, the gray owl, is such a common fixture in Nordic folklore, and just known. So there's a lot lost there, unfortunately. And just from my own knowledge, I haven't super kind of hound dogged into it, but I don't know where the ancient source of Frigga's distaff comes from in reference to the constellation. And I've only been really looking at more of the evolution of the Orion and Herculean connection there. But yeah, I don't have much to offer on that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, neither do I. I've heard that about Freya's distaff forever, but I don't recall ever seeing where that's attested in any way. And, I think it depends. I think there's probably, more esoteric astrological connections in all of the ancient cultures about the stars to one degree or another. But I think that also the reason I was struggling with the word for it is I think it counts as astronomy if you're just recognizing pictures. But it's when you add the overlay of deeper esoteric meanings to them that it becomes astrology. But either way, I'm sure that our people had a wealth of, that's one of the things, if you consider, what to do, people didn't sit around and watch Netflix and play around on their computer and read books and do stuff. Our most ancient ancestors at night, they talked around the fire, they watched the fire, they looked up at the sky. And especially if you can do that away from the ambient light of cities and towns. I remember growing up in Alaska, that's something we used to love to do when we'd go camp, is it'd be dark up there in the middle of the night. And we'd just go out in the middle of a frozen lake and just look up, and you could see forever, and you could see the northern lights, and you could see the stars. And it's such a primally mysterious and fascinating thing that our ancestors must have stared at for millennia. And I guarantee you there's a lot of lore to that we've lost over time. Next question. I'm not sure if it was asked. Any updates on Sigrheim and Pioneers? Thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Got one guy that's living close by in a RV situation, waiting to get some services established at Sigrheim before he moves onto the property. Got another guy that is currently selling his house and packing up and going to be moving out to Sigrheim, next to immediately. And our first person that's going to actually make landfall on Sigrheim as far as any kind of permanency, she is fixing to do that as we speak. I think she may in fact get on the road tomorrow to do that, to head that direction. So we are getting that figured out. We've had people, I mentioned it last call, but I don't know if you're here. We had a expedition out there a couple of weeks ago with some of our folks to take some more specific measurements and to talk to a septic guy and to lay out some different plans. So we're absolutely moving forward on that. It's really, really exciting. Our Tennessee Folk Builder is hosting a moot on Sigrheim on the 22nd of this month. And yeah, we're planning stuff, and we're going to have a big regional event there on July the 22nd. We're going to have Sigrblot at Sigrheim. I'm very excited to be at that and to see as many of you at that who'd like to be there. It's going to be awesome. It's a beautiful and amazing place, and I'd love to show that off to each of you guys. Next question: what happens to the Asatru during Ragnarok? I can't remember ever reading anything beyond Frigg crying out at Odin's death. Do we know? If not, in your belief, are we not meant to? I don't recall anything in regards to that, but it's not terribly surprising to me. The story of Ragnarok is about opposing forces meeting on a field and fighting, and I don't, the non-combatants are not part of those kind of battle tales. I don't think it really fits the story narrative. I don't think there's necessarily some great reason that we don't know what happened, but no, I don't recall any specifics of that in our lore, and I don't think there's a profound mystery to it personally. What do you think, Svan?
Well, I do know of there is a unique mention of Freya and Njord surviving Ragnarok. It's just briefly mentioned that they returned to the land of the Vanir. They returned to the source of the West. But as far as Frigg or any of the other Ausenir, it's not mentioned. And I think, again, that's because poetic meter and verse, it's about the, they're clearly showing the immediacy of forces fighting Jormungandr and Thor, Heimdall and Loki, and it's really about the things coming to head. But it is mentioned that the survivors too, like Magne and Modi, but there's no mention of Thruth. The source, I think it's more important to realize that the forces that are coming together are disseminating, and in reality, the gods will make themselves known after the fact. Magni and Modi, Vauli and Vidar, Balder, all of the gods that supersede the threshold of Ragnarok will make themselves known to the generation that comes out of the tree, which is life and the will to live, or the thirst, or the desire to live. And that generation, because we're not talking about an actual just singular individual, one man, one woman, especially when their name is life and the will to live. But that is the new folk, the folk that survive. They will then build those relationships with the gods, because those are the gods that remain, and they will be known to them. And then we may come to know them if we ever move through that threshold of our bloodlines. But it's not, I think, something that we deeply need to ponder, because that threshold will be, as it is said, it's very, very detrimental to the cosmic order and the natural law. Things get broken down, and then they will return slowly again, and that is as we know it. But yeah, I do know that Njord and Freya are mentioned as returning to the West. So that's the only, one that I absolutely have based off lore.
All right. Next question. I think there's a misunderstanding that is a good chance for you to clear up. Question for Svan. Why do you take Njord as Frigg? I know there's a little theory about a possibility of common epithets, but everything points to Njord as a Jotun, just like Gerther, as far as I know.
Okay, so that is a misunderstanding. I do not. That was a little earlier back of Obsidian. We were talking about that, and I do not. Like, that's actually, I was arguing in opposition to that train of thought. No, I honor Njord separate from Frigg, and have honored them in their own rights. I've honored Gerd, but I'm a big proponent for the pushing that Snorri did slap Jotun as a title on a lot of things without fully understanding the scope of all of it for the sake of organization. And I have always held in my personal belief that there are Ausenir, and then there are Ausenir who birth gods or marry the gods and thus align themselves with the gods. And since they are not like different races, they are, the Jotun and the Aus are different because of the powers that they are. That once you align yourself with the powers of the Aus, you become an Aus, or you birth an Aus, and that alignment shows. The only unique one that ever points out is the primordial connection. The seat of the blood of Ymir, the primordial connection, is hosted by Aegir and Raun, the two Jotuns they don't marry into the gods because they're already married. So that's a complete male and feminine power that's showing completion. And they rest in the primordial bowl of Ymir's blood, which is the ocean, the one place where primordial life truly comes from. And we see animals inside the blood of Ymir that clearly resonate all the way back to when the Jotuns were springing from him. And this kind of leads into a question or a statement just above. So I'm not trying to defer, but Rydberg talked about the two giant clans of Ymir, the upper body noble and the lower body base. I think it's also worth mentioning that, yes, there could have been some correlation to ancient caste systems, just like the story of Rig having the thrall, Carl, and Jarl is a lending to those caste systems, which is perfectly fine. But beyond that, there's a greater arching part of that story is that all of the Jotuns are killed in the deluge, that the only two that survive are Berjelmer and his wife, who is unnamed, and they escape. And from them, the descendants of both good or, like, I guess, less than terrible Jotuns and terrible Jotuns descend from them. So that's worth remembering. But when we talk about like Jord and say Gerd, you know, whether like, so Gerd is pretty clear in her descendancy as coming from a Jotun, and so is Skadi. But one interesting thing about them is that they are clearly upper caste or upper evolved Jotuns, so much so that they align themselves with the gods. Whether they do that through marriage and the combining of through trial with Skadi, or through the ultimate like resistance that happens between Gerd and Frey, which of course we know is about the seed and the light and the sun and the spring and the warmth giving way to the icy earth. So Gerd is, you know, those, I honor them as Ausenir, which sometimes I have found has been a hot, kind of a spicy take. You know, you consider Skadi or Gerd to be, you know, a god. Well, they're part of the Aesir. They are aligned to the Aesir. They give birth to Aesir gods, whether we're talking about Gridr or Rindr. Yes, so I do. I consider Mimir was once the Aus. His head is removed and he's placed on the wellspring of memory and time in the middle world. He is the godhead placed by Odin himself. But I don't say, oh, he's just a Jotun. No, he was clearly connected to his nephew, Odin. He aligned himself with that and became a component, a part of that. And so is there connection to their primordialness make them Jotuns? Quite clearly, but there's a lot of primordialness in the gods themselves. I think that a lot of people need to realize the difference between an Aesir and a Jotun. If they take the word Jotun and say that that's a primordial ancient, and that the Aesir are cosmic order ancients, that would clarify a lot of things and stop thinking of them as like completely different races.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I don't know. That's to answer that question. I don't think that. I see them as separate. And that's talking about the our church sees things in multiplicity. So we don't cram Jord and Frigg together. We see them as, you know, their domains, their dominions, and the sources that flow through them from the primordial source that is Ymir's flesh, and the earth is unique unto themselves.
All right. And then last question of the night. Do you think a good place to bloat Frigg would be a swamp, considering that Finsaler is Frigg's residence? We touched on this earlier, but I'm going to say this again. I think that any place within reason, any place that is special and you're trying to make sanctified, is a good place if your heart is right and your intentions are right to honor our gods. But that adds meaning, knowing that, you know, her residence has that Finn name associated with it. I think that, you know, offerings in a bog or a swamp are a special and a nice thing if that is meaningful to you as a place to honor our goddesses specifically, or generally, and Frigg specifically. But the more important thing is that you make the point of honoring her, and if that's done in the right mindset and with the right heart, then, you know, whatever place you choose will be the right place to do that. What are your thoughts, Svan?
And I'm speaking from personal devotion. I've always given gift to Frigg in the home. Always have, whether it's around the oven and the stove, or at the fireplace and the hearth, depending on different parts, like during Yule, oftentimes I'll give and pay devotional homage to her via the hearth, where we hang mistletoe above and we burn the Yule log in there. I have also given my location where I'm at. I am near the ocean, and I am also near one of the largest natural springs in the United States that produces a swamp, if you will, around it. But it's actually a swamp land created by the spring itself. George Washington tried to build a road through it and could not do it. The spring did not allow it to happen. It just kind of constantly eroded away all the attempts. Most people might not know it, but it's the Great Dismal Swamp, as it is referred to. And so I have a unique, I have given bloat in lagoons in Blackwater, which is on the border of Virginia, North Carolina. And I've given those gifts to Njord because it's right into the ocean estuaries and things. I've also given gift to Nerthus at Njord in the Great Dismal Swamp, and I've given homage to Frigg in my home. So that's just my personal stuff, but that's because that's how I connect my devotion to them. Is I see Frigg as like the reference to the cow goddess is important, because the cattle goddess, or the goddess of society and of Fehu and of the wealth of an established society, is so pervasive in our belief, in all the way back to the Indo-Europeans, is that is about connection to the home. Whereas of course the wilding of things, especially with Vanir, or more strongly sourced older Vanir of the waning, I do that near water and the earth, because I've always associated the Vana as the ebb and flow of the liquid and the material, or mass. It moves, it ebbs and flows, it formulates together and it breaks apart. And so the only thing eternal about it is the cycles. Whereas, like, the gods, especially after union with the Aesir, become more in association with the eternal. And even though Frigga is deeply connected to the natural cycle of childbirth and of death and of the home and of the family, along with Sif, I've always associated her more in the home. And I'm quite devout to Frigg as well. I have a personal story, which I feel like I was gifted something by her in relation to the birth of my daughter, whose birthday's coming up here. I was given a blue heron feather when I gave prayer to Frigg. I was worried about her birth and about my wife and her health, and on my way to work, I found this strange, clear, dry blue feather sticking vertically straight up in dewy grass that was completely wet and moist. And I pulled the feather, and I later did biological check on it, and it's from a blue heron, which is, I think, culturally, the bird that is connected to Frigg, especially in modern times, because I think ancient connections to the heron may be in relation to the ladle that mead was given out. When the women brought out the broggerful mead, they poured it mead into the horns. They did so with a ladle that had a heron head on it. And there's reference to that the heron of forgetfulness that flies over the hall. That makes another reference to it. But brewing and the disbursement of mead was very much a feminine ritual part of our culture, in which the women brewed a lot of the mead that was got, the honey and things were got by the menfolk, and they would brew them in the home, and they were part of the disbursement of mead into the horns of family members and honored guests. So Frigga is kind of representative in that with the heron, and I received a blue heron feather, and after that I knew the answer was clear, that she had said everything's going to be okay. I heard your prayer, that your maiden, my maiden, or I'm speaking from in her regards, how I received it was that her maiden, now the maiden of Fensaler who takes prayers to her, successfully delivered my prayer to her, and she reciprocated an answer, and I believe that wholeheartedly. I have that feather on my harrow now, and I think about it often, and I'm very, very thankful to Frigg for the blessings of giving me healthy children, giving me a healthy daughter, and watching over my wife, who again became the very threshold that Frigg's domain flows through in our society. She was the threshold.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us once again, Svan. It's always a pleasure to have you on. We had a lot of really meaty discussion tonight, so thank you for that. I know our listeners really appreciate that.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well, you guys have been great. Lots of really, really good questions. I'm glad to be able to get on here and talk to you guys every week. It's really a special thing, and I appreciate it. We will see you, or I will see you again next Wednesday. Svan will join us 2 weeks from today. And till then, hail the gods, hail the folk, hail the AFA, and remember that victory never sleeps.